Chapters 17 and 18 of The Witness for the Defense by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, Trouble for Mr. Hazlewood. When Dick and Stella walked along the drive to the lane, Harold Hazlewood, who was radiant at the success of his dinner party, turned to Robert Pettifer in the hall. "Have a whiskey and soda, Robert, before you go," he said. He led the way back into the library. Behind him walked the Pettifers, Robert ill at ease and wishing himself 100 miles away, Margaret Pettifer boiling for battle. Hazlewood himself dropped into an armchair. "I am very glad that you came to-night, Margaret," he said boldly. "You have seen for yourself." "Yes, I have," she replied. "Harold, there have been moments this evening when I could have screamed." Robert Pettifer hurriedly turned towards the table in the far corner of the room where the tray with the decanters and the siphons had been placed. "Margaret, I pass my life in a scream at the injustice of the world," said Harold Hazlewood, and Robert Pettifer chuckled as he cut off the end of a cigar. "It is strange that an act of reparation should move you in the same way." "Reparation!" cried Margaret Pettifer indignantly. Then she noticed that the window was open. She looked around the room. She drew up a chair in front of her brother. "Harold, if you have no consideration for us, none for your own position, none for the neighbourhood, if you will at all costs force this woman upon us, don't you think that you might still spare a thought for your son?" Robert Pettifer had kept his eyes open that evening, as well as his wife. He took a step down into the room. He was anxious to take no part in the dispute. He desired to be just. He was favourably inclined towards Stella Ballantyne. Looking at her, he had been even a little moved. But Dick was the first consideration. He had no children of his own. He cared for Dick as he would have cared for his son, and when he went up each morning by the train to his office in London, there lay at the back of his mind the thought that one day the fortune he was amassing would add a splendour to Dick's career. Harold Hazlewood alone of the three seemed to have his eyes sealed. "Why, what on earth do you mean, Margaret?" Margaret Pettifer sat down in her chair. "Where was Dick yesterday afternoon?" "Margaret, I don't know." "I do. I saw him. He was with Stella Ballantyne on the river. In the dusk. In a Canadian canoe." She uttered each fresh detail in a more indignant tone, as though it aggravated the crime. Yet even so she had not done. There was, it seemed, a culminating offence. She was wearing a white lace frock with a big hat. "Well," said Mr. Hazlewood mildly, "I don't think I have anything against big hats." "She was trailing her hand in the water. That he might notice its slenderness, of course. Outrageous, I call it." Mr. Hazlewood nodded his head at his indignant sister. "I know that frame of mind very well, Margaret," he remarked. "She cannot do right. If she had been wearing a small hat she would have been Frenchified." But Mrs. Pettifer was not in a mood for argument. "Can't you see what it all means?" she cried in exasperation. "I can, I do," Mr. Hazlewood retorted, and he smiled proudly upon his sister. "The boy's better nature is awakening." Margaret Pettifer lifted up her hands. "The boy!" she exclaimed. "He's 34 if he's a day." She leaned forward in her chair and pointing up to the bay asked, "Why is that window open, Harold?" Harold Hazlewood showed his first sign of discomfort. He shifted in his chair. "It's a hot night, Margaret." "That is not the reason," Mrs. Pettifer retorted implacably. "Where is Dick?" "I expect that he is seeing Mrs. Ballantyne home." "Exactly," said Mrs. Pettifer, with a world of significance in her voice. Mr. Hazlewood sat up and looked at his sister. "Margaret, you want to make me uncomfortable," he exclaimed pettishly, "but you shan't. No, my dear, you shan't." He let himself sink back again and, joining the tips of his fingers, contemplated the ceiling. But Margaret was in the mind to try. She shot out her words at him like so many explosive bullets. "Being friends is one thing, Harold. Marrying is another." "Very true, Margaret, very true." "They are in love with one another." "Rubbish, Margaret, rubbish." "I watched them at the dinner table and afterwards. They are man and woman, Harold. That's what you don't understand. They are not illustrations of your theories. Ask Robert." "No," exclaimed Robert Pettifer. He hurriedly lit a cigar. "Any inference I should make must be purely hypothetical." "Yes, we'll ask Robert. Come, Pettifer," said Mr. Hazlewood, "let us have your opinion." Robert Pettifer came reluctantly down from his corner. "Well, if you insist, I think they were very friendly." "Ah!" cried Hazlewood in triumph. "Being friends is one thing, Margaret. Marrying is another." Mrs. Pettifer shook her head over her brother with a most aggravating pity. "Dick said a shrewd thing the other day to me, Harold." Mr. Hazlewood looked doubtfully at his sister. "I am sure of it," he answered, but he was careful not to ask for any repetition of the shrewd remark. Margaret, however, was not in the mind to let him off. "He said that sentimental philosophers sooner or later break their heads against their own theories. Mark those words, Harold. I hope they won't come true of you. I hope so very much indeed." But it was abundantly clear that she had not a shadow of doubt that they would come true. Mr. Hazlewood was stung by the slighting phrase. "I am not a sentimental philosopher," he said hotly. "Sentiment I altogether abhor. I hold strong views, I admit." "You do indeed," his sister interrupted with an ironical laugh. "Oh, I have read your pamphlet, Harold. The prison walls must cast no shadow, and convicts, once they are released, have as much right to sit down at our dinner tables as they had before. Well, you carry your principles into practice, that I will say. We had an illustration to-night." "You are unjust, Margaret," and Mr. Hazlewood rose from his chair with some dignity. "You speak of Mrs. Ballantyne, not for the first time, as if she had been tried and condemned. In fact, she was tried and acquitted." And in his turn he appealed to Pettifer. "Ask Robert," he said. But Pettifer was slow to answer, and when he did it was without assurance. "Yes," he replied, with something of a drawl. "Undoubtedly Mrs. Ballantyne was tried and acquitted." And he left the impression on the two who heard him that with acquittal quite the last word had not been said. Mrs. Pettifer looked at him eagerly. She drew clear at once of the dispute. She left the questions now to Harold Hazlewood, and Pettifer had spoken with so much hesitation that Harold Hazlewood could not but ask them. "You are making reservations, Robert?" Pettifer shrugged his shoulders. "I think we have a right to know them," Hazlewood insisted. "You are a solicitor with a great business and consequently a wide experience." "Not of criminal cases, Hazlewood. I bring no more authority to judge them than any other man." "Still you have formed an opinion. Please let me have it." And Mr. Hazlewood sat down again and crossed his knees. But a little impatience was now audible in his voice. "An opinion is too strong a word," replied Pettifer guardedly. "The trial took place nearly 18 months ago. I read the accounts of it certainly day by day as I travelled in the train to London, but they were summaries." "Full summaries, Robert," said Hazlewood. "No doubt. The trial made a great deal of noise in the world, but they were not full enough for me. Even if my memory of those newspaper reports were clear, I should still hesitate to sit in judgment. But my memory isn't clear. Let us see what I do remember." Pettifer took a chair and sat for a few moments with his forehead wrinkled in a frown. Was he really trying to remember? His wife asked herself that question as she watched him. Or had he something to tell them which he meant to let fall in his own cautiously careless way? Mrs. Pettifer listened alertly. Let us call it the catastrophe, took place in a tent in some state of Rajputana." "Yes," said Mr. Hazlewood. "It took place at night. Mrs. Ballantyne was asleep in her bed. The man Ballantyne was found outside the tent in the doorway." "Yes." Pettifer paused. "So many law cases have engaged my attention since," he said in apology for his hesitation. He seemed quite at a loss. Then he went on. "Wait a moment. A man had been dining with them at night. Oh, yes, I begin to remember." Harold Hazlewood made a tiny movement and would have spoken, but Margaret held out a hand towards him swiftly. "Yes, a man called Thresk," said Pettifer, and again he was silent. "Well?" asked Hazlewood. "Well, that's all I remember," replied Pettifer briskly. He rose and put his chair back. "Except," he added slowly. "Yes?" "Except that there was left upon my mind when the verdict was published a vague feeling of doubt." "There!" cried Mrs. Pettifer triumphantly. "You hear him, Harold!" But Hazlewood paid no attention to her. He was gazing at his brother-in-law with a good deal of uneasiness. "Why?" he asked. "Why were you in doubt, Robert?" But Pettifer had said all that he had any mind to say. "Oh, I can't remember why," he exclaimed. "I am very likely quite wrong. Come, Margaret, it's time that we were getting home." He crossed over to Hazlewood and held out his hand. Hazlewood, however, did not rise. "I don't think that's quite fair of you, Robert," he said. "You don't disturb my confidence, of course. I have gone into the case thoroughly. But I think you ought to give me a chance of satisfying you that your doubts have no justification." "No, really," exclaimed Pettifer. "I absolutely refuse to mix myself up in the affair at all." A step sounded upon the gravel path outside the window. Pettifer raised a warning finger. "It's midnight, Margaret," he said. "We must go." And as he spoke Dick Hazlewood walked in through the open window. He smiled at the group of his relations with a grim amusement. They certainly wore a guilty look. He was surprised to remark some embarrassment even upon his father's face. "You will see your aunt off, Richard," said Mr. Hazlewood. "Of course." The Pettifers and Dick went out into the hall, leaving the old man in his chair, a little absent, perhaps a little troubled. "Aunt Margaret, you have been upsetting my father," said Dick. "Nonsense, Dick," she replied, and her face flushed. She stepped into the carriage quickly to avoid questions, and as she stepped in Dick noticed that she was carrying a little paper-covered book. Pettifer followed. "Good night, Dick," he said, and he shook hands with his nephew very warmly. In spite of his cordiality, however, Dick's face grew hard as he watched the carriage drive away. Stella was right. The Pettifers were the enemy. Well, he had always known there would be a fight, and now the sooner it came the better. He went back to the library, and as he opened the door he heard his father's voice. The old man was sitting sunk in his chair and repeating to himself, "I won't believe it. I won't believe it." He stopped at once when Dick came in. Dick looked at him with concern. "You are tired, father," he said. "Yes, I think I am a little. I'll go to bed." Hazlewood watched Dick walk over to the corner table where the candle stood beside the tray, and his face cleared. For the first time in his life the tidy, well-groomed, conventional look of his son was a real pleasure to him. Richard was one of those to whom the goodwill of the world meant much. He would never throw it lightly away. Hazlewood got up and took one of the candles from his son. He patted him on the shoulder. He became quite at ease as he looked into his face. "Good night, my boy," he said. "Good night, sir," replied Dick cheerfully. "There's nothing like acting up to one's theories, is there?" "Nothing," said the old man heartily. "Look at my life." "Yes," replied Dick. "And now look at mine. I am going to marry Stella Ballantyne." For a moment Mr. Hazlewood stood perfectly still. Then he murmured lamely, "Oh, are you? Are you, Richard?" And he shuffled quickly out of the room. Chapter 18. Mr. Hazlewood Seeks Advice. As Dick was getting out of bed at 7:30, a troubled little note was brought to him, written hurriedly and almost incoherent. "Dick, I can't ride with you this morning. I am too tired, and I don't think we should meet again. You must forget last night. I shall be very proud always to remember it, but I won't ruin you, Dick. You mustn't think I shall suffer so very much." Dick read it all through with a smile of tenderness upon his face. He wrote a line in reply. "I will come and see you at 11, Stella. Meanwhile, sleep, my dear," and sent it across to the cottage. Then he rolled back into bed again and took his own advice. It was late when he came down into the dining room, and he took his breakfast alone. "Where's my father?" he asked of Hubbard, the butler. "Mr. Hazlewood breakfasted half an hour ago, sir. He's at work now." "Capital," said Dick. "Give me some sausages. Hubbard, what would you say if I told you that I was going to be married?" Hubbard placed a plate in front of him. "I should keep my head, sir," he answered in his gentle voice. "Will you take tea?" "Thank you." Dick looked out of the window. It was a morning of clear skies and sunlight, a very proper morning for this the first of all the remarkable days which one after the other were going especially to belong to him. He was of the gods now. The world was his property, or rather he held it in trust for Stella. It was behaving well. Dick Hazlewood was contented. He ate a large breakfast, and strolling into the library lit his pipe. There was his father bending over his papers at his writing table before the window, busy as a bee, no doubt, at some new enthusiasm which was destined to infuriate his neighbours. Let him go on. Dick smiled benignly at the old man's back. Then he frowned. It was curious that his father had not wished him a good morning. Curious and unusual. "I hope, sir, that you slept well," he said. "I did not, Richard," and still the back was turned to him. "I lay awake considering with some care what you told me last night about Stella Ballantyne." Of late she had been simply Stella to Harold Hazlewood. The addition of Ballantyne was significant. It replaced friendliness with formality. "Yes, we agreed to champion her cause, didn't we?" said Dick cheerily. "You took one good step forward last night. I took another." "You took a long stride, Richard, and I think you might have consulted me first." Dick walked over to the table at which his father sat. "Do you know, that's just what Stella said," he remarked, and he seemed to find the suggestion rather unintelligible. Mr. Hazlewood snatched at any support which was offered to him. "Ah!" he exclaimed, and for the first time that morning he looked his son in the face. "There now, Richard, you see." "Yes," Richard returned imperturbably, "but I was able to remove all her fears. I was able to tell her that you would welcome our marriage with all your heart, for you would look upon it as a triumph for your principles and a sure sign that my better nature was at last thoroughly awake." Dick walked away from the table. The old man's face lengthened. If he was a philosopher at all, he was a philosopher in a piteous position, for he was having his theories tested upon himself. He was to be the experiment by which they should be proved or disproved. "No doubt," he said in a lamentable voice. "Quite so, Richard. Yes." And he caught at vague hopes of delay. "There's no hurry, of course. For one thing, I don't want to lose you. And then you have your career to think of, haven't you?" Mr. Hazlewood found himself here upon ground more solid and leaned his weight on it. "Yes, there's your career." Dick returned to his father, amazement upon his face. He spoke as one who cannot believe the evidence of his ears. "But it's in the army, father. Do you realise what you're saying? You want me to think of my career in the British Army?" Consistency, however, had no charms for Mr. Hazlewood at this moment. "Exactly," he cried. "We don't want to prejudice that, do we? No, no, Richard. Oh, I hear the finest things about you. And they push the young men along nowadays. You don't have to wait for grey hairs before you're made a general, Richard. So we must keep an eye on our prospects, eh? And for that reason it would be advisable, perhaps—" and the old man's eyes fell from Dick's face to his papers. "Yes, it would certainly be advisable to let your engagement remain for a while just a private matter between the three of us." He took up his pen as though the matter was decided and discussion at an end. But Dick did not move from his side. He was the stronger of the two, and in a little while the old man's eyes wandered up to his face again. There was a look there which Margaret Pettifer had seen a week ago. Dick spoke, and the voice he used was strange and formidable to his father. "There must be no secrecy, father. I remember what you said. For uncharitable slander an English village is impossible to beat. Our secret would be known within a week, and by attempting to keep it we invite suspicion. Nothing could be more damaging to Stella than secrecy. Consequently, nothing could be more damaging to me. I don't deny that things are going to be a little difficult, but of this I am sure." And his voice, though it still was quiet, rang deep with confidence. "Our one chance is to hold our heads high. No secrecy, father. My hope is to make a life which has been very troubled know some comfort and a little happiness." Mr. Hazlewood had no more to say. He must renounce his gods or hold his tongue. And renounce his gods, no, that he could not do. He heard in imagination the whole neighbourhood laughing. He saw it a sea of laughter overwhelming him. He shivered as he thought of it. He, Harold Hazlewood, the man emancipated from the fictions of society, caught like a silly struggling fish in the net of his own theories. No, that must never be. He flung himself at his work. He was revising the catalogue of his miniatures, and in a minute he began to fumble and search about his overloaded desk. "Everybody is trying to thwart me this morning," he cried angrily. "What's the matter, father?" asked Dick, laying down the Times. "Can I help?" "I wrote a question to Notes and Queries about the Marie Antoinette miniature which I bought at Lord Merlaton's sale, and there was an answer in the last number, a very complete answer, but I can't find it. I can't find it anywhere." And he tossed his papers about as though he were punishing them. Dick helped in the search, but beyond a stray copy or two of "The Prison Walls Must Cast No Shadow," there was no publication to be found at all. "Wait a bit, father," said Dick suddenly. "What is Notes and Queries like? The only Notes and Queries I read are contained in a pink paper. They are very amusing, but they do not deal with miniatures." Mr. Hazlewood described the appearance of the little magazine. "Well, that's very extraordinary," said Dick, "for Aunt Margaret took it away last night." Mr. Hazlewood looked at his son in blank astonishment. "Are you sure, Richard?" "I saw it in her hand as she stepped into her carriage." Mr. Hazlewood banged his fist upon the table. "It's extremely annoying of Margaret," he exclaimed. "She takes no interest in such matters. She is not, if I may use the word, a virtuoso. She did it solely to annoy me." "Well, I wonder," said Dick. He looked at his watch. It was 11 o'clock. He went out into the hall, picked up a straw hat, and walked across the meadow to the thatched cottage on the river bank. But while he went he was still wondering why in the world Margaret had taken away that harmless little magazine from his father's writing table. "Pettifer's at the bottom of it," he concluded. "There's a foxy fellow for you. I'll keep my eye on Uncle Robert." He was near to the cottage. Only a rail separated its garden from the meadow. Beyond the garden a window stood open, and within the room he saw the flutter of a lilac dress. From the window of the library Mr. Hazlewood watched his son open the garden gate. Then he unlocked a drawer of his writing table and took out a large sealed envelope. He broke the seal and drew from the envelope a sheaf of press cuttings. They were the verbatim reports of Stella Ballantyne's trial, which had been printed day by day in the Times of India. he had sent for them months ago when he had blithely taken upon himself the defence of Stella Ballantyne. He had read them with a growing ardour. So harshly had she lived, so shadowless was her innocence. He turned to them now in a different spirit. Pettifer had been left by the English summaries of the trial with a vague feeling of doubt. Mr. Hazlewood respected Robert Pettifer. The lawyer was cautious, deliberate, unemotional, qualities with which Hazlewood had instinctively little sympathy. But on the other hand he was not bound hand and foot in prejudice. He could be liberal in his judgments. He had a mind clear enough to divide what reason had to say and the presumptions of convention. Suppose that Pettifer was, after all, right. The old man's heart sank within him. Then, indeed, this marriage must be prevented, and the truth must be made known, yes, widely known. He himself had been deceived, like many another man before him. It was not ridiculous to have been deceived. He remained at all events consistent to his principles. There was his pamphlet, to be sure. The prison walls must cast no shadow. That gave him an uncomfortable twinge. But he reassured himself. There I argue that once the offence has been expiated, all the principles should be restored. But if Pettifer is right, there has been no expiation. That saving clause let him out. He did not thus phrase the position even to himself. He clothed it in other and high-sounding words. It was, after all, a sort of convention to accept acquittal as the proof of innocence. But at the back of his mind, from first to last, there was an immense fear of the figure which he himself would cut if he refused his consent to the marriage on any ground except that of Stella Ballantyne's guilt. For Stella herself, the woman, he had no kindness to spare that morning. Yesterday he had overflowed with it. For yesterday she had been one more proof to the world how high he soared about it. Since Pettifer's in doubt, he said to himself, there must be some flaw in this trial which I overlooked in the heat of my sympathy. And to discover that flaw he read again every printed detail of it, from the morning when Stella first appeared before the stipendiary magistrate to that other morning a month later when the verdict was given, and he found no flaw. Stella's acquittal was inevitable on the evidence. There was much to show what provocation she had suffered, but there was no proof that she had yielded to it. On the contrary, she had endured so long, the presumption must be that she would go on enduring to the end. And there was other evidence, positive evidence given by Thresk, which could not be gainsaid. Mr. Hazlewood replaced his cuttings in the drawer, and he was utterly discontented. He had hoped for another result. There was only one point which puzzled him, and that had nothing really to do with the trial, but it puzzled him so much that it slipped out at luncheon. "Richard," he said, "I cannot understand why the name of Thresk is so familiar to me." Dick glanced quickly at his father. "You have been reading over again the accounts of the trial." Mr. Hazlewood looked confused. "And a very natural proceeding, Richard," he declared. "But while reading over the trial I found the name Thresk familiar to me in another connection, but I cannot remember what the connection is." Dick could not help him, nor was he at that time concerned by the failure of his father's memory. He was engaged in realizing that here was another enemy for Stella. Knowing his father, he was not greatly surprised, but he thought it prudent to attack without delay. "Stella will be coming over to tea this afternoon," he said. "Will she, Richard?" the father replied, twisting uncomfortably in his chair. "Very well. Of course." "Hubbard knows of my engagement, by the way," Dick continued implacably. "Hubbard? God bless my soul!" cried the old man. "It'll be all over the village already." "I shouldn't wonder," replied Dick cheerfully. "I told him before I saw you this morning whilst I was having breakfast." Mr. Hazlewood remained silent for a while. Then he burst out petulantly. "Richard, there's something I must speak to you seriously about. The lateness of your hours in the morning. I have noticed it with great regret. It is not considerate to the servants, and it cannot be healthy for you. Such indolence, too, must be enervating to your mind." Dick forbore to remind his father that he was usually out of the house before 7. "Father," he said, at once a very model of humility, "I will endeavour to reform." Mr. Hazlewood concealed his embarrassment at tea time under a show of overwork. He had a great deal to do. Just a moment for a cup of tea, no more. There was to be a meeting of the County Council the next morning, when a most important question of small holdings was to come up for discussion. Mr. Hazlewood held the strongest views. He was engaged in shaping them in the smallest possible number of words. To be brief, to be vivid, there was the whole art of public speaking. Mr. Hazlewood chattered feverishly for 5 minutes. He had come in chattering, he went out chattering. "That's all right, Stella, you see," said Dick cheerfully, when they were left alone. Stella nodded her head. Mr. Hazlewood had not said one word in recognition of her engagement, but she had made her little fight that morning. She had yielded, and she could not renew it. She had spent 3 miserable hours framing reasonable arguments why last night should be forgotten. But the sight of her lover coming across the meadow had set her heart so leaping that she could only stammer out a few tags and phrases. "Oh, I wish you hadn't come," she had repeated, and repeated all the while her blood was leaping in her body for joy that he had. She had promised in the end to stand firm, to stand by his side, and brave what, after all, but the clamour of a week? So he put it, and so she was eager to believe. Mr. Hazlewood, busy though he made himself out to be, found time that evening to drive in his motor car into Great Beeding, and when the London train pulled up at the station he was on the platform. He looked anxiously at the passengers who descended until he saw Robert Pettifer. He went up to him at once. "What in the world are you doing here?" asked the lawyer. "I came on purpose to catch you, Robert. I want to speak to you in private. My car is here. If you will get into it with me we can drive slowly towards your house." Pettifer's face changed, but he could not refuse. Hazlewood was agitated and nervous. Of his ordinary complacency there was no longer a trace. Pettifer got into the car, and as it moved away from the station he asked, "Now, what's the matter?" "I have been thinking over what you said last night, Robert. You had a vague feeling of doubt. Well, I have the verbatim reports of the trial in Bombay here in this envelope, and I want you to read them carefully through and give me your opinion." He held out the envelope as he spoke, but Pettifer thrust his hands into his pockets. "I won't touch it," he declared. "I refuse to mix myself up in the affair at all. I said more than I meant to last night." "But you did say it, Robert." "Then I withdraw it now." "But you can't, Robert. You must go further. Something has happened to-day, something very serious." "Oh?" said Pettifer. "Yes," replied Mr. Hazlewood. "Margaret really has more insight than I credit her with. They propose to get married." Pettifer sat upright in the car. "You mean Dick and Stella Ballantyne?" "Yes." And for a little while there was silence in the car. Then Mr. Hazlewood continued to bleat. "I never suspected anything of the kind. It places me, Robert, in a very difficult position." "I can quite see that," answered Pettifer with a grim smile. "It's really the only consoling element in the whole business. You can't refuse your consent without looking a fool, and you can't give it while you're in any doubt as to Mrs. Ballantyne's innocence." Mr. Hazlewood was not, however, quite prepared to accept that definition of his position. "You don't exhaust the possibilities, Robert," he said. "I can quite well refuse my consent and publicly refuse it if there are reasonable grounds for believing that there was in that trial a grave miscarriage of justice." Mr. Pettifer looked sharply at his companion. The voice no less than the words fixed his attention. This was not the Mr. Hazlewood of yesterday. The champion had dwindled into a figure of meanness. Harold Hazlewood would be glad to discover those reasonable grounds, and he would be very much obliged if Robert Pettifer would take upon himself the responsibility of discovering them." "Yes, I see," said Pettifer slowly. He was half inclined to leave Harold Hazlewood to find his way out of his trouble by himself. It was all his making, after all. But other and wider considerations began to press upon Pettifer. He forced himself to omit altogether the subject of Hazlewood's vanities and entanglements. "Very well. Give the cuttings to me. I will read them through, and I will let you know my opinion. Their intention to marry may alter everything. My point of view as much as yours." Mr. Pettifer took the envelope in his hand and got out of the car as soon as Hazlewood had stopped it. "You have raised no objections to the engagement?" he asked. "A word to Richard this morning. Of not much effect, I'm afraid." Mr. Pettifer nodded. "Right. I should say nothing to anybody. You can't take a decided line against it at present, and to snarl it would be the worst policy imaginable. Today's Thursday. We'll meet on Saturday. Good night," and Robert Pettifer walked away to his own house. He walked slowly, wondering at the eternal mystery by which this particular man and that individual woman select each other out of the throng. He owed the greater part of his fortune to the mystery, like many another lawyer, but to-night he would willingly have yielded a good portion of it up if that process of selection could be ordered in a more reasonable way. Love? The attraction of sex? Yes, no doubt. But why these two specimens of sex? Why Dick and Stella Ballantyne? When he reached his house his wife hurried forward to meet him. Already she had the news. There was an excitement in her face not to be misunderstood. The futile time-honoured phrase of triumph so ready on the lips of those who have prophesied evil was trembling upon hers. "Don't say it, Margaret," said Pettifer very seriously. "We have come to a pass where light words will lead us astray. Hazlewood has been with me. I have the reports of the trial here." Margaret Pettifer put a check upon her tongue, and they dined together almost in complete silence. Pettifer was methodically getting his own point of view quite clearly established in his mind, so that whatever he did or advised he might be certain not to swerve from it afterwards. He weighed his inclinations and his hopes, and when the servants had left the dining-room and he had lit his cigar, he put his case before his wife. "Listen, Margaret, you know your brother. He is always in extremes. He swings from one to the other. He is terrified now lest this marriage should take place." "No wonder," interposed Mrs. Pettifer. Pettifer made no comment upon the remark. "Therefore," he continued, "he is anxious that I should discover in these reports some solid reason for believing that the verdict which acquitted Stella Ballantyne was a grave miscarriage of justice. For any such reason must have weight." "Of course," said Mrs. Pettifer. "And will justify him, this is his chief consideration, in withholding publicly his consent." "I see." Only a week ago Dick himself had observed that sentimental philosophers had a knack of breaking their heads against their own theories. The words had been justified sooner than she had expected. Mrs. Pettifer was not surprised at Harold Hazlewood's swift change any more than her husband had been. Harold, to her thinking, was a sentimentalist, and sentimentality was like a fir tree, a thing of no deep roots and easily torn up. "But I do not take that view, Margaret," continued her husband, and she looked at him with consternation. Was he now to turn champion, he who only yesterday had doubted? "And I want you to consider whether you can agree with me. There is, to begin with, the woman herself, Stella Ballantyne. I saw her for the first time yesterday, and to be quite honest, I liked her, Margaret. Yes, it seemed to me that there was nothing whatever of the adventuress about her. And I was impressed. I will go further. I was moved, dry as dust old lawyer as I am, by something. How shall I express it without being ridiculous?" He paused and searched in his vocabulary, and gave up the search. No, the epithet which occurred to me yesterday at the dinner table and immediately still seems to me the only true one. I was moved by something in this woman of tragic experiences which was strangely virginal. One quick movement was made by Margaret Pettifer. The truth of her husband's description was a revelation, so exact it was. Therein lay Stella Ballantyne's charm and her power to create champions and friends. Her history was known to you, the miseries of her marriage, the suspicion of crime. You expected a woman of adventures, and lo, there stood before you one with something virginal in her appearance and her manner, which made its soft and irresistible appeal. I recognize that feeling of mine, Pettifer resumed, and I try to put it aside. And putting it aside, I ask myself, and you, Margaret, this. Here's a woman who has been through a pretty bad time, who has been unhappy, who has stood in the dock, who has been acquitted. Is it quite fair that when at last she has floated into a haven of peace, two private people, like Hazlewood and myself, should take it upon ourselves to review the verdict and perhaps reverse it? But there's Dick, Robert, cried Mrs. Pettifer. There's Dick. Surely he's our first thought. Yes, there's Dick, Mr. Pettifer repeated. And Dick's my second point. You are all worrying about Dick from the social point of view, the external point of view. Well, we have got to take that into our consideration. But we are bound to look at him, the man, as well. Don't forget that, Margaret. Well, I find the 2 points of view identical. But our neighbours won't. Will you? Mrs. Pettifer was baffled. I don't understand, she said. I'll explain. From the social standpoint, what's really important as regards Dick? That he should go out to dinner? No. That he should have children? Yes. And here Mrs. Pettifer interposed again. But they must be the right children, she exclaimed. Better that he should have none than that he should have children. With an hereditary taint, Pettifer agreed. Admitted, Margaret. If we come to the conclusion that Stella Ballantyne did what she was accused of doing, we, in spite of all the verdicts in the world, are bound to resist this marriage. I grant it. Because of that conviction, I dismiss the plea that we are unfair to the woman in reviewing the trial. There are wider, greater considerations. These were the first words of comfort which Mrs. Pettifer had heard since her husband began to expound. She received them with enthusiasm. I am so glad to hear that. Yes, Margaret, Pettifer retorted dryly. But please ask yourself this question. It is where, to my thinking, the social and the personal elements join. If this marriage is broken off, is Dick likely to marry at all? Why not? Asked Margaret. He is 34. He has had, no doubt, many opportunities of marriage. He must have had. He is good-looking, well off, and a good fellow. This is the first time he has wanted to marry. If he is disappointed here, will he try again? Mrs. Pettifer laughed, moved by the remarkable depreciation of her own sex which women of her type so often have. It was for man to throw the handkerchief, not a doubt but there would be a rush to pick it up. Widowers who have been devoted to their wives marry again, she argued. A point for me, Margaret, returned Pettifer. Widowers, yes. They miss so much, the habit of a house with a woman its mistress, the companionship, the order, 1,000 small but important things. But a man who has remained a bachelor until he's 34, that's a different case. If he sets his heart at that age, seriously, for the first time on a woman, and does not get her, that's the kind of man who, my experience suggests to me, I put it plainly, Margaret, will take one or more mistresses to himself, but no wife. Mrs. Pettifer deferred to the worldly knowledge of her husband, but she clung to her one clear argument. Nothing could be worse, she said frankly, than that he should marry a guilty woman. Granted, Margaret, replied Mr. Pettifer imperturbably. Only suppose that she's not guilty. There are you and I, rich people, and no one to leave our money to. no one to carry on your name, no one we care a rap about to benefit by my work and your brother's fortune, no one of the family to hand over little Beeding to." Both of them were silent after he had spoken. He had touched upon their one great sorrow. Margaret herself had her roots deep in the soil of little Beeding. It was hateful to her that the treasured house should ever pass to strangers, as it would do if this last branch of the family failed. "But Stella Ballantyne was married for 7 years," she said at last, "and there were no children." "No, that's true," replied Pettifer, "but it does not follow that with a second marriage there will be none. It's a chance, I know, but—" and he got up from his chair. "I do honestly believe that it's the only chance you and I will have, Margaret, of dying with the knowledge that our lives have not been altogether vain. We've lighted our little torch. Yes, and it burns merrily enough. But what's the use unless at the appointed milestone there's another of us to take it and carry it on?" He stood looking down at his wife with a wistful and serious look upon his face. "Dick's past the age of calf love. We can't expect him to tumble from one passion to another, and he's not easily moved. Therefore I hope very sincerely that these reports which I am now going to read will enable me to go boldly to Harold Hazlewood and say, 'Stella Ballantyne is as guiltless of this crime as you or I.'" Mr. Pettifer took up the big envelope which he had placed on the table beside him and carried it away to his study. Chapter 18. Chapters 19, 20, and 21 of The Witness for the Defence by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Pettifer's Plan. On the Saturday morning Mr. Hazlewood drove over early to Great Beeding. His impatience had so grown during the last few days that his very sleep was broken at night, and in the daytime he could not keep still. The news of Dick's engagement to Stella Ballantyne was now known throughout the countryside, and the blame for it was laid upon Harold Hazlewood's shoulders. For blame was the general note, blame and chagrin. A few bold and kindly spirits went at once to see Stella. A good many more seriously and at great length debated over their tea-tables whether they should call after the marriage. But on the whole the verdict was an indignant no. Disgrace was being brought upon the neighbourhood. Little Beeding would be impossible. Dick Hazlewood only laughed at the constraint of his acquaintances, and when 3 of them crossed the road hurriedly in Great Beeding, to avoid Stella and himself, he said good-humouredly, "They are like an ill-trained company of bad soldiers. Let one of them break from the ranks and they'll all stream away so as not to be left behind. You'll see, Stella. One of them will come, and the rest will tumble over one another to get into your drawing-room." How much he believed of what he said Stella did not inquire. She had a gift of silence. She just walked a little nearer to him and smiled, lest any should think that she had noticed the slight. The one man, in a word, who showed signs of wear and tear was Mr. Hazlewood himself. So keen was his distress that he had no fear of his sister's sarcasms. Think of it," he exclaimed, in a piteous bewilderment. "Actually I have become sensitive to public opinion." And Mrs. Pettifer forbore from the comments which she very much longed to make. She was in the study when Harold Hazlewood was shown in, and Pettifer had bidden her to stay. "Margaret knows that I have been reading these reports," he said. "Sit down, Hazlewood, and I'll tell you what I think." Mr. Hazlewood took a seat facing the garden with its old red brick wall, on which a purple clematis was growing. "You have formed an opinion then, Robert?" "One." "What is it?" he asked eagerly. Robert Pettifer clapped the palm of his hand down upon the cuttings from the newspapers which lay before him on the desk. "This. No other verdict could possibly have been given by the jury. On the evidence produced at the trial in Bombay, Mrs. Ballantyne was properly and inevitably acquitted." "Robert!" exclaimed his wife. She, too, had been hoping for the contrary opinion. As for Hazlewood himself, the sunlight seemed to die off that garden. He drew his hand across his forehead. He half rose to go when again Robert Pettifer spoke. "And yet," he said slowly, "I am not satisfied." Harold Hazlewood sat down again. Mrs. Pettifer drew a breath of relief. "The chief witness for the defence, the witness whose evidence made the acquittal certain, was a man I know, a barrister called Thresk." "Yes," interrupted Hazlewood. "I have been puzzled about that man ever since you mentioned him before. His name I am somehow familiar with." "I'll explain that to you in a minute," said Pettifer, and his wife leaned forward suddenly in her chair. She did not interrupt, but she sat with a look of keen expectancy upon her face. She did not know whither Pettifer was leading them, but she was now sure that it was to some carefully pondered goal. "I have more than once briefed Thresk myself. He's a man of the highest reputation at the bar, straightforward, honest. He enjoys a great practice. He is in Parliament with a great future in Parliament. In a word, he is a man with everything to lose if he lied as a witness in a trial. And yet I am not satisfied." Mr. Pettifer's voice sank to a low murmur. He sat at his desk staring out in front of him through the window. "Why?" asked Hazlewood. But Pettifer did not answer him. He seemed not to hear the question. He went on in the low quiet voice he had used before, rather like one talking to himself than to a companion. "I should very much like to put a question or two to Mr. Thresk." "Then why don't you?" exclaimed Mrs. Pettifer. "You know him." "Yes." Mr. Hazlewood eagerly seconded his sister. "Since you know him, you are the very man." Pettifer shook his head. "It would be an impertinence. For although I look upon Dick as a son, I am not his father. You are, Hazlewood, you are. He wouldn't answer me." "Would he answer me?" asked Hazlewood. "I don't know him at all. I can't go to him and ask if he told the truth." "No, no, you can't do that," Pettifer answered, "nor do I mean you to. I want to put my questions myself in my own way, and I thought that you might get him down to Little Beeding." "But I have no excuse," cried Hazlewood, and Mrs. Pettifer at last understood the plan which was in her husband's mind, which had been growing to completion since the night when he had dined at Little Beeding. "Yes, you have an excuse," she cried, and Pettifer explained what it was. "You collect miniatures. Some time ago you bought one of Marie Antoinette at Lord Mirliton's sale. You asked a question as to its authenticity in Notes and Queries. It was answered—" Mr. Hazlewood broke in excitedly. "By a man called Thresk. That is why the name was familiar to me. But I could not remember." He turned upon his sister. "It's your fault, Margaret. You took my copy of Notes and Queries away with you. Dick noticed it and told me." "Dick!" Pettifer exclaimed in alarm. But the alarm passed. "He cannot have guessed why." Mrs. Pettifer was clear upon the point. "No, I took the magazine because of a remark which Robert made to you. Dick did not hear it. No, he cannot have guessed why." "For it's important that he should have no suspicion whatever of what I propose that you should do, Hazlewood," Pettifer said gravely. "I propose that we should take a lesson from the legal processes of another country. It may work, it may not, but to my mind it is our only chance." "Let me hear," said Hazlewood. "Thresk is an authority on old silver and miniatures. He has a valuable collection himself. His advice is sought by people in the trade. You know what collectors are. Get him down to see your collection. It wouldn't be the first time that you've invited a stranger to pass a night in your house for that purpose, would it?" "No." "And the invitation has often been accepted?" "Well, sometimes." We must hope that it will be this time. Get Thresk down to Little Beeding upon that excuse. Then confront him unexpectedly with Mrs. Ballantyne, and let me be there." Such was the plan which Pettifer suggested. A period of silence followed upon his words. Even Mr. Hazlewood, in the extremity of his distress, recoiled from it. "It would look like a trap." Mr. Pettifer thumped his table impatiently. "Let's be frank, for heaven's sake. It wouldn't merely look like a trap, it would be one. It wouldn't be at all a pretty thing to do, but there's this marriage." "No, I couldn't do it," said Hazlewood. "Very well. There's no more to be said." Pettifer himself had no liking for the plan. It had been his intention originally to let Hazlewood know that if he wished to get into communication with Thresk there was a means by which he could do it. But the fact of Dick's engagement had carried him still further, and now that he had read the evidence of the trial carefully, there was a real anxiety in his mind. Pettifer sealed up the cuttings in a fresh envelope and gave them to Hazlewood, and went out with them to the door. "Of course," said the old man, "if your legal experience, Robert, leads you to think that we should be justified—" "But it doesn't," Pettifer was quick to interpose. He recognized his brother-in-law's intention to throw the discredit of the trick upon his shoulders, but he would have none of it. "No, Hazlewood," he said cheerfully, "it's not a plan which a high-class lawyer would be likely to commend to a client." "Then I am afraid that I couldn't do it." "All right," said Pettifer, with his hand upon the latch of the door. "Thresk's chambers are in King's Bench Walk." He added the number. "I simply couldn't think of it," Hazlewood repeated as he crossed the pavement to his car. "Perhaps not," said Pettifer. "You have the envelope? Yes. Choose an evening towards the end of the week. A Friday will be your best chance of getting him." "I will do nothing of the kind, Pettifer." "And let me know when he is coming. Good-bye." The car carried Mr. Hazlewood away, still protesting that he really couldn't think of it for an instant. But he thought a good deal of it during the next week, and his temper did not improve. "Pettifer has rubbed off the finer edges of his nature," he said to himself. "It is a pity, a great pity, but 30 years of life in a lawyer's office must no doubt have that effect. I regret very much that Pettifer should have imagined that I would condescend to such a scheme." Chapter 20. On the Downs. They went up by the steep chalk road which skirts the park wall to the top of the conical hill above the racecourse. An escarpment of grass banks guards a hollow like a shallow crater on the very summit. They rode round it upon the rim, now facing the black slope of Charlton Forest across the valley to the north, now looking out over the plain and Chichester. 30 miles away, above the sea, the chalk cliffs of the Isle of Wight gleamed under their thatch of dark turf. It was not yet 9 in the morning. Later the day would climb dustily to noon. Now it had the wonder and the stillness of great beginnings. A faint haze like a veil at the edges of the sky, and a freshness of the air made the world magical to these two who rode high above the weald and sea. Stella looked downwards to the silver flash of the broad waters west of Chichester spire. "That way they came, perhaps on a day like this," she said slowly, "those old centurions." "Your thoughts go back," said Dick Hazlewood with a laugh. "Not so far as you think," cried Stella, and suddenly her cheeks took fire and a smile dimpled them. "Oh, I dare to think of many things to day." She rode down the steep grass slope towards the racecourse with Dick at her side. It was the first morning they had ridden together since the night of the dinner party at Little Beeding. Mr. Hazlewood was at this moment ordering his car so that he might drive to the town and learn what Pettifer had discovered in the cuttings from the newspapers. But they were quite unaware of the plot which was being hatched against them. They went forward under the high beech trees, watching for the great roots which stretched across their path, and talking little. An open way between wooden posts led them now on to turf and gave them the freedom of the downs. They saw no one. With the larks and the fieldfares they had the world to themselves, and in the shade beneath the hedges the dew still sparkled on the grass. They left the long arm of Halnaker Down upon their right, its old mill standing up on the edge like some lighthouse on a bluff of the sea, and crossing the high road from up Waltham, rode along a narrow glade amongst beeches and nut trees and small oaks and bushes of wild roses. Open spaces came again. Below them were the woods and the green country of Slindon and the deep grass of Dale Park. And so they drew near to Gumber Corner, where Staines Street climbs over Bignor Hill. Here Dick Hazlewood halted. "I suppose we turn." "Not to-day," said Stella, and Dick turned to her with surprise. Always before they had stopped at this point, and always by Stella's wish. Either she was tired, or was needed at home, or had letters to write. Always there had been some excuse and no reason. Dick Hazlewood had come to believe that she would not pass this point, that the downland beyond was a sort of Tom Tiddler's ground on which she would not trespass. He had wondered why, but his instinct had warned him from questions. He had always turned to this spot immediately, as if he believed the excuse which she had ready. Stella noticed the surprise upon his face, and the blushes rose again in her cheeks. "You knew that I would not go beyond," she said. "Yes." "But you did not know why." There was a note of urgency in her voice. "I guessed," he said. "I mean, I played with guesses. Oh, not seriously," and he laughed. "There runs Staines Street from Chichester to London, and through London to the great North Wall. Up that road the Romans marched, and back by that road they returned to their galleys in the water there by Chichester. I pictured you living in those days, a Boadicea of the Weald, who would set her heart against her will on some dashing captain of old Rome camped here on the top of Bignor Hill. You crept from your own people at night to meet him in the lane at the bottom. Then came week after week when the street rang with the tramp of soldiers returning from London and Lichfield in the north to embark in their boats for Gaul and Rome." "They took my captain with them?" cried Stella, laughing with him at the conceit. "Yes, so my fable ran. He pined for the circus and the theatre and the painted ladies, so he went willingly." "The brute!" cried Stella. "And so I broke my heart over a decadent philanderer in a suit of bright brass clothes, and remember it 1300 years afterwards in another life. Thank you, Captain Hazlewood." "No, you don't actually remember it, Stella, but you have a feeling that round about Staines Street you once suffered great humiliation and unhappiness." And suddenly Stella rode swiftly past him, but in a moment she waited for him and showed him a face of smiles. "You see, I have crossed Staines Street to-day, Dick," she said. "We'll ride on to Arundel." "Yes," answered Dick, "my story won't do." And he remembered a sentence of hers spoken an hour and a half ago. "My thoughts do not go back as far as you think." At all events she was emancipated to-day, for they rode on until at the end of a long gentle slope the great arch of the gate into Arundel Park gleamed white in a line of tall dark trees. Chapter 20. Chapter 21. The Letter is Written. But Stella's confidence did not live long. Mr. Hazlewood was a child at deceptions, and day by day his anxieties increased. His friends argued with him, his folly and weakness were the themes, and he must needs repel the argument though his thoughts echoed every word they used. Never was a man brought to such a piteous depth of misery by the practice of his own theories. He sat by the hour at his desk, burying his face amongst his papers if Dick came into the room, with a great show of occupation. He could hardly bear to contemplate the marriage of his son, yet day and night he must think of it and search for expedients which might put an end to the trouble and let him walk free again with his head raised high. But there were only the two expedients. He must speak out his fears that justice had miscarried, and that device his vanity forbade, or he must adopt Pettifer's suggestion, and from that he shrank almost as much. He began to resent the presence of Stella Ballantyne, and he showed it. Sometimes a friendliness so excessive that it was almost hysterical betrayed him; more usually a discomfort and constraint. He avoided her if by any means he could. If he could not quite avoid her, an excuse of business was always on his lips. "Your father hates me, Dick," she said. "He was my friend until I touched his own life. Then I was in the black books in a second." Dick would not hear of it. "You were never in the black books at all, Stella," he said, comforting her as well as he could. "We knew that there would be a little struggle, didn't we? But the worst of that's over. You make friends daily." "Not with your father, Dick. I go back with him. Ever since that night, it's 3 weeks ago now, when you took me home from Little Beeding." "No!" cried Dick, but Stella nodded her head gloomily. "Mr. Pettifer dined here that night. He's an enemy of mine." "Stella," young Hazlewood remonstrated, "you see enemies everywhere." And upon that Stella broke out with a quivering troubled face. "Is it wonderful? Oh, Dick, I couldn't lose you. A month ago, before that night, yes. Nothing had been said. But now I couldn't. I have often thought it would be better for me to go right away and never see you again. And I have tried to tell you something, Dick, ever so many times." "Yes?" said Dick. He slipped his arm through hers and held her close to him as though to give her courage and security. "Yes, Stella?" And he stood very still. "I mean," she said, looking down upon the ground, "that I have tried to tell you that I wouldn't suffer so very much if we did part, but I never could do it. My lips shook so, I could never speak the words." Then her voice ran up into a laugh. "To think of your living in a house with somebody else! Oh, no!" "You need have no fear of that, Stella." They were in the garden of Little Beeding, and they walked across the meadow towards her cottage, talking very earnestly. Mr. Hazlewood was watching them secretly from the window of the library. He saw that Dick was pleading and she hanging in doubt, and a great wave of anger surged over him that Dick should have to plead to her at all, he who was giving everything, even his own future. "King's Bench Walk," he muttered to himself, taking from the drawer of his writing-table a slip of paper on which he had written the address lest he should forget it. "Yes, that's the address." And he looked at it for a long time very doubtfully. Suppose that his suspicions were correct. His heart sank at the supposition. Surely he would be justified in setting any trap. But he shut the drawer violently and turned away from his writing-table. Even his pamphlets had become trivial in his eyes. He was brought face to face with real passions and real facts, had been fetched out from his cloister and was blinking miserably in a full measure of daylight. How long could he endure it, he wondered. The question was settled for him that very evening. He and his son were taking their coffee on a paved terrace by the lawn after dinner. It was a dark, quiet night, with a clear sky of golden stars. Across the meadow the light shone in the windows of Stella's cottage. "Father," said Dick, after they had sat in constrained silence for a little while, "why don't you like Stella any longer?" The old man blustered in reply. "A lawyer's question, Richard. I object to it very strongly. You assume that I have ceased to like her?" "It's extremely evident," said Dick dryly. "Stella has noticed it." "And complained to you, of course," cried Mr. Hazlewood resentfully. "Stella doesn't complain." And then Dick leaned over and spoke in the full quiet voice which his father had grown to dread. There rang in it so much of true feeling and resolution. "There can be no backing down now. We are both agreed upon that, aren't we? Imagine for an instant that I were first to blazon my trust in a woman whom others suspected by becoming engaged to her, and then endorsed their suspicions by breaking off the engagement. Suppose I were to do that!" Mr. Hazlewood allowed his longings to lead him astray. For a moment he hoped. "Well?" he asked eagerly. "You wouldn't think very much of me, would you?" Not you nor any man. A cur, that would be the word, the only word, wouldn't it?" But Mr. Hazlewood refused to answer that question. He looked behind him to make sure that none of the servants were within hearing. Then he lowered his voice to a whisper. "What if Stella has deceived you, Dick?" It was too dark for him to see the smile upon his son's face, but he heard the reply, and the confidence of it stung him to exasperation. "She hasn't done that," said Dick. "If you are sure of nothing else, sir, you may be quite certain of what I am telling you now. She hasn't done that." He remained silent for a few moments, waiting for any rejoinder, and getting none, he continued, "There's something else I wanted to speak to you about." "Yes?" "The date of our marriage." The old man moved sharply in his chair. "There's no hurry, Richard. You must find out how it will affect your career. You have been so long at Little Beeding, where we hear very little from the outer world. You must consult your colonel." Dick Hazlewood would not listen to the argument. "My marriage is my affair, sir, not my colonel's. I cannot take advice, for we both of us know what it would be. And we both of us value it at its proper price, don't we?" Mr. Hazlewood could not reply. How often had he inveighed against the opinions of the sleek worldly people who would add up advantages in a column and leave out of their consideration the merits of the higher life. "It would not be fair to Stella were we to ask her to wait," Dick resumed. "Any delay. Think what will be made of it. A month or 6 weeks from now, that gives us time enough." The old man rose abruptly from his chair with a vague word that he would think of it, and went into the house. He saw again the lovers as he had seen them this afternoon, walking side by side slowly towards Stella Ballantyne's cottage, and the picture even in the retrospect was intolerable. The marriage must not take place, yet it was so near. A month or 6 weeks! Mr. Hazlewood took up his pen and wrote the letter to Henry Thresk at last, as Robert Pettifer had always been sure that he would do. It was the simplest kind of letter and took but a minute in the writing. It mentioned only his miniatures, and invited Henry Thresk to Little Beeding to see them, as more than one stranger had been asked before. The answers which Thresk had given to the questions and notes and queries were pleaded as an introduction, and Thresk was invited to choose his own day and remain at Little Beeding for the night. The reply came by return of post. Thresk would come to Little Beeding on the Friday afternoon of the next week. He was in town, for Parliament was sitting late that year. He would reach Little Beeding soon after 5, so that he might have an opportunity of seeing the miniatures by daylight. Mr. Hazlewood hurried over with the news to Robert Pettifer. His spirits had risen at a bound. Already he saw the neighbourhood freed from the disturbing presence of Stella Ballantyne, and himself cheerfully resuming his multifarious occupations. Robert Pettifer, however, spoke in quite another strain. "I am not so sure as you, Hazlewood. The points which trouble me are very possibly capable of quite simple explanations. I hope for my part that they will be so explained." "You hope it?" cried Mr. Hazlewood. "Yes, I want Dick to marry," said Robert Pettifer. Mr. Hazlewood was not, however, to be discouraged. He drove back to his house, counting the days which must pass before Thresk's arrival, and wondering how he should manage to conceal his elation from the keen eyes of his son. But he found that there was no need for him to trouble himself on that point, for this very morning at luncheon Dick said to him, "I think I'll run up to town this afternoon, father. I might be there for a day or two." Mr. Hazlewood was delighted. No other proposal could have fitted in so well with his scheme. The mere fact that Dick was away would start people at the pleasant business of conjecturing mishaps and quarrels. Perhaps indeed the lovers had quarrelled. Perhaps Richard had taken his advice and was off to consult his superiors. Mr. Hazlewood scanned his son's face eagerly, but learned nothing from it, and he was too wary to ask any questions. "By all means, Richard," he said carelessly, "go to London. You will be back by next Friday, I suppose?" "Oh, yes, before that. I shall stay at my own rooms, so if you want me you can send me a telegram." Dick Hazlewood had a small flat of his own in some mansions at Westminster, which had seen very little of him that summer. "Thank you, Richard," said the old man, "but I shall get on very well, and a few days' change will no doubt do you good." Dick grinned at his father and went off that afternoon without a word of farewell to Stella Ballantyne. Mr. Hazlewood stood in the hall and saw him go with a great relief at his heart. Everything at last seemed to be working out to advantage. He could not but remember how so very few weeks ago he had been urgent that Richard should spend his summer at Little Beeding and lend a hand in the noble work of defending Stella Ballantyne against ignorance and unreason. But the twinge only lasted a moment. He had made a mistake, as all men occasionally do, yes, even sagacious and thoughtful people like himself. And the mistake was already being repaired. He looked across the meadow that night at the lighted blinds of Stella's windows and anticipated an evening when those windows would be dark and the cottage without an inhabitant. "Very soon," he murmured to himself, "very soon." He had not one single throb of pity for her now, not a single speculation whither she would go or what she would make of her life. His own defence of her had now become a fault of hers. He wished her no harm, he argued, but in a week's time there must be no light shining behind those blinds. End of chapter 21. Chapters 22 and 23 of The Witness for the Defence by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. A Way Out of the Trap. Mr. Hazlewood was very glad that Richard was away in London during this week. Excitement kept him feverish, and the fever grew as the number of days before Thresk was to come diminished. He would never have been able to keep his secret had every meal placed him under his son's eyes. He was free, too, from Stella herself. He met her but once on the Monday, and then it was in the deep lane leading towards the town. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening, and she was driving homewards in an open fly. Mr. Hazlewood stopped it and went to the side. "Richard is away, Stella, until Wednesday, as no doubt you knew," he said. "But I want you to come over to tea when he comes back. Will Friday suit you?" She had looked a little frightened when Mr. Hazlewood had called to the driver and stopped the carriage. But at his words the blood rushed into her cheeks and her eyes shone, and she pushed out her hand impulsively. "Oh, thank you," she cried. "Of course I will come." Not for a long time had he spoken to her with so kind a voice and a face so unclouded. She rejoiced at the change in him, and showed him such gratitude as is given only to those who render great service, so intense was her longing not to estrange Dick from his father. But she had become a shrewd observer under the stress of her evil destiny, and the moment of rejoicing once past, she began to wonder what had brought about the change. She judged Mr. Hazlewood to be one of those weak and effervescing characters who can grow more obstinate in resentment than any others if their pride and self-esteem receive an injury. She had followed of late the windings of his thoughts. She put the result frankly to herself. "He hates me. He holds me in horror." Why then the sudden change? She was in the mood to start at shadows, and when a little note was brought over to her on the Friday morning in Mr. Hazlewood's handwriting reminding her of her engagement, she was filled with a vague apprehension. The note was kindly in its terms, yet to her it had a menacing and sinister look. Had some stroke been planned against her? Was it to be delivered this afternoon? Dick came at 4:30 from a village cricket match to fetch her. "You are ready, Stella? Right, for we can't spare very much time. I have a surprise for you." Stella asked him what it was, and he answered, "There's a house for sale in Great Beeding. I think that you would like it." Stella's face softened with a smile. "Anywhere, Dick," she said. "Anywhere on earth." "But here, best of all," he answered. "Not to run away, that's our policy. We'll make our home in our own south country. I arranged to take you over the house between 5:30 and 6 this evening." They walked across to Little Beeding and were made welcome by Mr. Hazlewood. He came out to meet them in the garden, and nervousness made him kittenish and arch. "How are you, Stella?" he inquired. "But there's no need to ask. You look charming, and upon my word you grow younger every day. What a pretty hat! Yes, yes. Will you make tea while I telephone to the Pettifers? They seem to be late." He skipped off with an alacrity which was rather ridiculous, but Stella watched him go without any amusement. "I am taken again into favour," she said doubtfully. "That shouldn't distress you, Stella," replied Dick. "Yet it does, for I ask myself why. And I don't understand this tea party. Mr. Hazlewood was so urgent that I should not forget it. Perhaps, however, I am inventing trouble." She shook herself free from her apprehensions and followed Dick into the drawing room where the kettle was boiling and the tea service spread out. Stella went to the table and opened the little mahogany caddy. "How many are coming, Dick?" she asked. "The Pettifers." "My enemies," said Stella, laughing lightly. "And you and my father and myself." "5 altogether," said Stella. She began to measure out the tea into the teapot, but stopped suddenly in the middle of her work. "But there are 6 cups," she said. She counted them again to make sure, and at once her fears were reawakened. She turned to Dick, her face quite pale and her big eyes dark with forebodings. So little now was needed to disquiet her. "Who is the 6th?" Dick came closer to her and put his arm about her waist. "I don't know," he said gently. "But what can it matter to us, Stella? Think, my dear." "No, of course," she replied. "It can't make any difference." And she dipped her teaspoon once more into the caddy. "But it's a little curious, isn't it, that your father didn't mention to you that there was another guest?" "Oh, wait a moment," said Dick. "He did tell me there would be some visitor here to day, but I forgot all about it. He told me at luncheon. There's a man from London coming down to have a look at his miniatures." "His miniatures?" Stella was pouring the hot water into the teapot. She replaced the kettle on its stand and shut the tea caddy. "And Mr. Hazlewood didn't tell you the man's name?" she said. "I didn't ask him," answered Dick. "He often has collectors down." "I see." Her head was bent over the tea table. She was busy with her brew of tea. "And I was specially asked to come this afternoon. I had a note this morning to remind me." She looked at the clock. "Dick, if we are to see that house this afternoon, you had better change now before the visitors come." "That's true, I will." Dick started towards the door, and he heard Stella come swiftly after him. He turned. There was so much trouble in her face. He caught her in his arms. "Dick," she whispered, "look at me. Kiss me. Yes, I am sure of you." And she clung to him. Dick Hazlewood laughed. "I think we ought to be fairly happy in that house." And she let him go with a smile, repeating her own words. "Anywhere, Dick, anywhere on earth." She waited, watching him tenderly until the door was closed. Then she covered her face with her hands and a sob burst from her lips. But the next moment she tore her hands away and looked wildly about the room. She ran to the writing table and scribbled a note. She thrust it into an envelope and gummed the flap securely down. Then she rang the bell and waited impatiently with a leaping heart until Hubbard came to the door. "Did you ring, madam?" he asked. "Yes. Has Mr. Thresk arrived yet?" She tried to control her face, to speak in a careless and indifferent voice, but she was giddy and the room whirled before her eyes. "Yes, madam," the butler answered. And it seemed to Stella Ballantyne that once more she stood in the dock and heard the verdict spoken. Only this time it had gone against her. That queer old shuffling butler became a figure of doom. His thin and piping voice uttered her condemnation. For here, without her knowledge, was Henry Thresk, and she was bidden to meet him with the Pettifers for witnesses. But it was Henry Thresk who had saved her before. She clung to that fact now. "Mr. Thresk arrived a few minutes ago." Just before old Hazlewood had come forward out of the house to welcome her. No wonder he was in such high spirits. Very likely all that great show of kindliness and welcome was made only to keep her in the garden for a few necessary moments. "Where is Mr. Thresk now?" she asked. "In his room, madam." "You are quite sure?" "Quite." "Will you take this note to him, Hubbard?" and she held it out to the butler. "Certainly, madam." "Will you take it at once? Give it into his hands, please." Hubbard took the note and went out of the room. Never had he seemed to her so dilatory and slow. She stared at the door as though her sight could pierce the panels. She imagined him climbing the stairs with feet which loitered more at each fresh step. Some one would surely stop him and ask for whom the letter was intended. She went to the door which led into the hall, opened it and listened. No one was descending the staircase, and she heard no voices. Then, above her, Hubbard knocked upon a door. A latch clicked as the door was opened. A hollow jarring sound followed as the door was sharply closed. Stella went back into the room. The letter had been delivered. At this moment Henry Thresk was reading it, and with a sinking heart she began to speculate in what spirit he would receive its message. Henry Thresk! The unhappy woman bestirred herself to remember him. He had grown dim to her of late. How much did she know of him? She asked herself. Once, years ago, there had been a month during which she had met him daily. She had given her heart to him, yet she had learned little or nothing of the man within the man's frame. She had not even made his acquaintance. That had been proved to her one memorable morning upon the top of Bignor Hill, when humiliation had so deeply seared her soul that only during this last month had it been healed. In the great extremities of her life Henry Thresk had decided, not she, and he was a stranger to her. She beat her poor wings in vain against that ironic fact. Never had he done what she had expected. On Bignor Hill, in the law court at Bombay, he had equally surprised her. Now, once more, he held her destinies in his hand. What would he decide? What had he decided? "Yes, he will have decided now," said Stella to herself, and a certain calm fell upon her troubled soul. Whatever was to be was now determined. She went back to the tea table and waited. Henry Thresk had not much of the romantic in his character. He was a busy man, making the best and the most of the rewards which the years had brought to him, and slamming the door each day upon the day which had gone before. He made his life in the intellectual exercise of his profession and his membership of the House of Commons. Upon the deeps of the emotions he had closed a lid. Yet he had set out with a vague reluctance to Little Beeding, and once his motor car had passed Hindhead and dipped into the Weald of Sussex, the reluctance had grown to a definite regret that he should once more have come into this country. His recollections were of a dim, far-off time, so dim that he could hardly believe that he had any very close relation with the young struggling man who had spent his first real holiday there. But the young man had been himself, and he had missed his opportunity high up on the downs by Arundel. Words which Jane Repton had spoken to him in Bombay came back to him on this summer afternoon like a refrain to the steady hum of his car. "You can get what you want so long as you want it enough, but you cannot control the price you will have to pay." He had reached Little Beeding only a few moments before Dick and Stella had crossed into the garden. He had been led by Hubbard into the library, where Mr. Hazlewood was sitting. From the windows he had even seen the thatched cottage where Stella Ballantyne dwelt, and its tiny garden bright with flowers. "It is most kind of you to come," Mr. Hazlewood had said. "Ever since we had our little correspondence I have been anxious to take your opinion upon my collection. though how in the world you manage to find time to have an opinion at all upon the subject is most perplexing. I never open the Times but I see your name figuring in some important case." "And I, Mr. Hazlewood," Thresk replied with a smile, "never open my mail without receiving a pamphlet from you. I am not the only active man in the world." Even at that moment Mr. Hazlewood flushed with pleasure at the flattery. "Little reflections," he cried, with a modest deprecation, "worked out more or less to completeness, may I say that, in the quiet of a rural life, sparks from the tiny flame of my midnight oil." He picked up one pamphlet from a stack by his writing table. "You might perhaps care to look at The Prison Walls." Thresk drew back. "I have got mine, Mr. Hazlewood," he said firmly. "Every man in England should have one. No man in England has a right to two." Mr. Hazlewood fairly twittered with satisfaction. Here was a notable man from the outside world of affairs who knew his work and held it in esteem. Obviously then he was right to take these few disagreeable twists and turns which would ensure to him a mind free to pursue his labours. He looked down at the pamphlet, however, and his satisfaction was a trifle impaired. "I am not sure that this is quite my best work," he said timidly. "A little hazardous, perhaps." "Would you say that?" asked Thresk. "Yes, indeed I should." Mr. Hazlewood had the air of one making a considerable concession. "The very title is inaccurate. The prison walls must cast no shadow." He repeated the sentence with a certain unction. "The rhythm is perhaps not amiss, but the metaphor is untrue. My son pointed it out to me. As he says, all walls cast shadows." "Yes," said Thresk. "The trouble is to know where and on whom the shadow is going to fall." Mr. Hazlewood was startled by the careless words. He came to earth heavily. All was not as yet quite ready for the little trick which had been devised. The Pettifers had not arrived. "Perhaps you would like to see your room, Mr. Thresk," he said. "Your bag has been taken up, no doubt. We will look at my miniatures after tea." "I shall be delighted," said Thresk as he followed Hazlewood to the door. "But you must not expect too much knowledge from me." "Oh," cried his host with a laugh, "Pettifer tells me you are a great authority." "Then Pettifer's wrong," said Thresk, and so stopped. "Pettifer? Pettifer? Isn't he a solicitor?" "Yes, he told me that he knew you. He married my sister. They are both coming to tea." With that he led Thresk to his room and left him there. The room was over the porch of the house and looked down the short level drive to the iron gates and the lane. It was all familiar ground to Thresk, or rather to that other man with whom Thresk's only connection was a dull throb at his heart, a queer uneasiness and discomfort. He leaned out of the window. He could hear the river singing between the grass banks at the bottom of the garden behind him. He would hear it through the night. Then came a knocking upon his door, and he did not notice it at once. It was repeated, and he turned and said, "Come in." Hubbard advanced with a note upon a salver. "Mrs. Ballantyne asked me to give you this at once, sir." Thresk stared at the butler. The name was so apposite to his thoughts that he could not believe it had been uttered. But the salver was held out to him, and the handwriting upon the envelope removed his doubts. He took it up, said "Thank you" in an absent voice, and waited until the door was closed again and he was alone. The last time he had seen that writing was 18 months ago. A little note of thanks, blurred with tears and scribbled hastily and marked with no address, had been handed to him in Bombay. Stella Ballantyne had disappeared then. She was here now at Little Beeding, and his relationship with the young struggling barrister of 10 years back suddenly became actual and near. He tore open the envelope and read, "Be prepared to see me. Be prepared to hear news of me. I will have a talk with you afterwards if you like. This is a trap. Be kind." He stood for a while with the letter in his hand, speculating upon its meaning, until the wheels of a car grated on the gravel beneath his window. The Pettifers had come. But Thresk was in no hurry to descend. He read the note through many times before he hid it away in his letter case and went down the stairs. Chapter 22. Chapter 23. Message from France. Meanwhile, Stella Ballantyne waited below. She heard Mr. Hazlewood in the hall greeting the Pettifers with the false joviality which sat so ill upon him. She imagined the shy nods and glances which told them that the trap was properly set. Mr. Hazlewood led them into the room. "Is tea ready, Stella? We won't wait for Dick," he said, and Stella took her place at the table. She had her back to the door by which Thresk would enter. She had not a doubt that thus her chair had been deliberately placed. He would be in the room and near to the table before he saw her. He would not have a moment to prepare himself against the surprise of her presence. Stella listened for the sound of his footsteps in the hall. She could not think of a single topic to talk about except the presence of that extra sixth cup, and that she must not mention it if the tables were really to be turned upon her antagonists. Surprise must be visible upon her side when Thresk did come in. But she was not alone in finding conversation difficult. Embarrassment and expectancy weighed down the whole party, so that they began suddenly to speak at once and simultaneously to stop. Robert Pettifer, however, asked if Dick was playing cricket, and so gave Harold Hazlewood an opportunity. "No, the match was over early," said the old man, and he settled himself in his armchair. "I have given some study to the subject of cricket," he said. "You?" asked Stella with a smile of surprise. Was he merely playing for time, she wondered? But he had the air of contentment with which he usually embarked upon his disquisitions. "Yes, I do not consider our national pastime beneath a philosopher's attention. I have formed 2 theories about the game." "I am sure you have," Robert Pettifer interposed. "And I have invented 2 improvements, though I admit at once that they will have to wait until a more enlightened age than ours adopts them. In the first place," and Mr. Hazlewood flourished a forefinger in the air, "the game ought to be played with a soft ball. There is at present a suggestion of violence about it which the use of a soft ball would entirely remove." "Entirely," Mr. Pettifer agreed, and his wife exclaimed impatiently, "Rubbish, Harold, rubbish!" Stella broke nervously into the conversation. "Violence? Why, even women play cricket, Mr. Hazlewood." "I cannot, Stella," he returned, "accept the view that whatever women do must necessarily be right. There are instances to the contrary." "Yes, I come across a few of them in my office," Robert Pettifer said grimly, and once more embarrassment threatened to descend upon the party. But Mr. Hazlewood was off upon a favourite theme. His eyes glistened, and the object of the gathering vanished for the moment from his thoughts. "And in the second place," he resumed, "the losers should be accounted to have won the game." "Yes, that must be right," said Pettifer. "Upon my word you are in form, Hazlewood." "But why?" asked Mrs. Pettifer. Harold Hazlewood smiled upon her as upon a child, and explained. "Because by adopting that system you would do something to eradicate the spirit of rivalry, the desire to win, the ambition to beat somebody else, which is at the bottom of half our national troubles." "And all our national success," said Pettifer. Hazlewood patted his brother-in-law upon the shoulder. He looked at him indulgently. "You are a Tory, Robert," he said, and implied that argument with such an one was mere futility. He had still his hand upon Pettifer's shoulder when the door opened. Stella saw by the change in his face that it was Thresk who was entering, but she did not move. "Ah," said Mr. Hazlewood, "come over here and take a cup of tea." Thresk came forward to the table. He seemed altogether unconscious that the eyes of the 2 men were upon him. "Thank you. I should like one," he said, and at the sound of his voice Stella Ballantyne turned around in her chair. "You!" she cried, and the cry was pitched in a tone of pleasure and welcome. "Of course you know Mrs. Ballantyne," said Hazlewood. He saw Stella rise from her chair and hold out her hand to Thresk with the colour of flame in her cheeks. "You are surprised to see me again," she said. Thresk took her hand cordially. "I am delighted to see you again," he replied. "And I to see you," said Stella, "for I have never yet had a chance of thanking you." And she spoke with so much frankness that even Pettifer was shaken in his suspicions. She turned upon Mr. Hazlewood with a mimicry of indignation. "Do you know, Mr. Hazlewood, that you have done a very cruel thing?" Mr. Hazlewood was utterly discomfited by the failure of his plot, and when Stella attacked him so directly he had not a doubt but that she had divined his treachery. "I?" he gasped. "Cruel? How?" "In not telling me beforehand that I was to meet so good a friend of mine." Her face relaxed to a smile as she added, "I would have put on my best frock in his honour." Undoubtedly Stella carried off the honour of that encounter. She had at once driven the battle with spirit onto Hazlewood's own ground and left him worsted and confused. But the end was not yet. Mr. Hazlewood waited for his son Richard, and when Richard appeared he exclaimed, "Ah, here's my son. Let me present him to you, Mr. Thresk. And there's the family." He leaned back with a smile in his eyes, watching Henry Thresk. Robert Pettifer watched too. "The family?" Thresk asked. "Is Mrs. Ballantyne a relation then?" "She is going to be," said Dick. "Yes," Mr. Hazlewood explained, still beaming and still watchful. "Richard and Stella are going to be married." A pause followed which was just perceptible before Thresk spoke again. But he had his face under control. He took the stroke without flinching. He turned to Dick with a smile. "Some men have all the luck," he said, and Dick, who had been looking at him in bewilderment, cried, "Mr. Thresk! Not the Mr. Thresk to whom I owe so much?" "The very man," said Thresk, and Dick held out his hand to him gravely. "Thank you," he said. "When I think of the horrible net of doubt and assumption in which Stella was coiled, I tell you I feel cold down to my spine even now. If you hadn't come forward with your facts—" "Yes," Thresk interposed, "if I hadn't come forward with my facts. But I couldn't well keep them to myself, could I?" A few more words were said, and then Dick rose from his chair. "Time's up, Stella," and he explained to Henry Thresk, "We have to look over a house this afternoon." "A house? Yes, I see," said Thresk, but he spoke slowly, and there was just audible a little inflection of doubt in his voice. Stella was listening for it. She heard it when her two antagonists noticed nothing. "But Dick," she said quickly, "we can put the inspection off." "Not on my account," Thresk returned. "There's no need for that." He was not looking at Stella whilst he spoke, and she longed to see his face. She must know exactly how she stood with him, what he thought of her. She turned impulsively to Mr. Hazlewood. "I haven't been asked, but may I come to dinner? You see, I owe a good deal to Mr. Thresk." Mr. Hazlewood was for the moment at a loss. He had not lost hope that between now and dinner time explanations would be given which would banish Stella Ballantyne altogether from Little Beeding. But he had no excuse ready, and he stammered out, "Of course, my dear. Didn't I ask you? I must have forgotten. I certainly expect you to dine with us to-night. Margaret will no doubt be here." Margaret Pettifer had taken little part in the conversation about the tea-table. She sat in frigid hostility, speaking only when politeness commanded. She accepted her brother's invitation with a monosyllable. "Thank you," said Stella, and she faced Henry Thresk, looking him straight in the eyes but not daring to lay any special stress upon the words. "Then I shall see you to-night." Thresk read in her face a prayer that he should hold his hand until she had a chance to speak with him. She turned away and went from the room with Dick Hazlewood. The old man rose as soon as the door was closed. "Now we might have a look at the miniatures, Mr. Thresk. You will excuse us, Margaret, won't you?" "Of course," she answered, upon a nod from her husband. The two men passed through the doors into the great library, whilst Thresk took a more ceremonious leave of Mrs. Pettifer, and, as Hazlewood opened the doors of his cabinets, Robert Pettifer said in a whisper: "That was a pretty good failure, I must say. And it was my idea, too." "Yes," replied Hazlewood, in a voice as low. "What do you think?" "That they share no secret." "You are satisfied, then?" "I didn't say that," and Thresk himself appeared in the doorway and went across to the writing table upon which Hazlewood had just laid a drawer in which miniatures were ranged. "I haven't met you," said Pettifer, "since you led for us in the great Birmingham will suit." "No," answered Thresk as he took his seat at the table. "It wasn't quite such a tough fight as I expected. You see, there wasn't one really reliable witness for the defence." "No," said Pettifer grimly. "If there had been, we should have been beaten." Mr. Hazlewood began to point out this and that miniature of his collection, bending over Thresk as he did so. It seemed that the two collectors were quite lost in their common hobby, until Robert Pettifer gave the signal. Then Mr. Hazlewood began: "I am very glad to meet you, Mr. Thresk, for reasons quite outside these miniatures of mine." He spoke with a noticeable awkwardness, yet Henry Thresk disregarded it altogether. "Oh?" he said carelessly. "Yes. Being Richard's father, I am naturally concerned in everything which affects him nearly. The trial of Stella Ballantyne, for instance." Thresk bent his head down over the tray. "Quite so," he said. He pointed to a miniature. "I saw that at Christie's and coveted it myself." "Did you?" Mr. Hazlewood asked, and he almost offered it as a bribe. "Now you gave evidence, Mr. Thresk." Thresk never lifted his head. "You have no doubt read the evidence I gave," he said, peering from this delicate jewel of the painter's art to that. "To be sure." "And since your son is engaged to Mrs. Ballantyne, I suppose that you were satisfied with it?" And he paused to give a trifle of significance to his next words. "As the jury was?" "Yes, of course," Mr. Hazlewood stammered. "But a witness, I think, only answers the questions put to him." "That is so," said Thresk, "if he is a wise witness." He took one of the miniatures out of the drawer and held it to the light. But Mr. Hazlewood was not to be deterred. "And subsequent reflection," he continued obstinately, "might suggest that all the questions which could throw light upon the trial had not been put." Thresk replaced the miniature in the drawer in front of him and leaned back in his chair. He looked now straight at Mr. Hazlewood. "It was not, I take it, in order to put those questions to me that you were kind enough, Mr. Hazlewood, to ask me to give my opinion on your miniatures? For that would have been setting a trap for me, wouldn't it?" Hazlewood stared at Thresk with the bland innocence of a child. "Oh, no, no," he declared, and then an insinuating smile beamed upon his long thin face. "Only, since you are here, and since so much is at stake for me, my son's happiness, I hope that you might perhaps give us an answer or two which would disperse the doubts of some suspicious people." "Who were they?" asked Thresk. "Neighbours of ours," replied Hazlewood, and thereupon Robert Pettifer stepped forward. He had remained aloof and silent until this moment. Now he spoke shortly, but he spoke to the point. "I, for one." Thresk turned with a smile upon Pettifer. "I thought so. I recognised Mr. Pettifer's hand in all this. but he ought to know that the sudden confrontation of a suspected person with unexpected witnesses takes place in those countries where the method is practised before the trial, not, as you so ingeniously arranged it this afternoon, 2 years after the verdict has been given." Robert Pettifer turned red. Then he looked whimsically across the table at his brother-in-law. "We had better make a clean breast of it, Hazlewood." "I think so," said Thresk gently. Pettifer came a step nearer. "We are in the wrong," he said bluntly. "But we have an excuse. Our trouble is very great. Here's my brother-in-law, to begin with, whose whole creed of life has been to deride the authority of conventional man, to tilt against established opinion. Mrs. Ballantyne comes back from her trial in Bombay to make her home again at Little Beeding. Hazlewood champions her, not for her sake, but for the sake of his theories. It pleases his vanity. Now he can prove that he is not as others are." Mr. Hazlewood did not relish this merciless analysis of his character. He twisted in his chair, he uttered a murmur of protest. But Robert Pettifer waved him down and continued. "So he brings her to his house. He canvasses for her. He throws his son in her way. She has beauty. She has something more than beauty. She stands apart as a woman who has walked through fire. She has suffered very much. Look at it how one will, she has suffered beyond her deserts. She has pretty, deferential ways which make their inevitable appeal to women as to men. In a word, Hazlewood sets the ball rolling, and it gets beyond his reach." Thresk nodded. "Yes, I understand that." "Finally, Hazlewood's son falls in love with her. Not a boy, mind, but a man, claiming a man's right to marry where he loves. And at once in Hazlewood conventional man awakes." "Dear me, no," interposed Harold Hazlewood. "But I say yes," Pettifer continued imperturbably. "Conventional man awakes in him and cries loudly against the marriage. Then there's myself. I'm fond of Dick. I have no child. He will be my heir, and I am not poor. He is doing well in his profession. To be an instructor of the Staff Corps at his age means hard work, keenness, ability. I look forward to a great career. I am very fond of him. And, understand me, Mr. Thresk," he checked his speech and weighed his words very carefully, "I wouldn't say that he shouldn't marry Stella Ballantyne just because Stella Ballantyne has lain under a grave charge of which she has been acquitted. No, I may be as formal as my brother-in-law thinks, but I hold a wider faith than that. But I am not satisfied. That is the truth, Mr. Thresk. I am not sure of what happened in that tent in far-away Chitipur after you had ridden away to catch the night mail to Bombay." Robert Pettifer had made his confession simply and with some dignity. Thresk looked at him for a few moments. Was he wondering whether he could answer the questions? Was he hesitating through anger at the trick which had been played upon him? Pettifer could not tell. He waited in suspense. Thresk pushed his chair back suddenly and came forward from behind the table. "Ask your questions," he said. "You consent to answer them?" Mr. Hazlewood cried joyously, and Thresk replied with coldness. "I must. For if I don't consent, your suspicions at once are double what they were. But I am not pleased." "Oh, we practised a little diplomacy," said Hazlewood, making light of his offence. "Diplomacy!" For the first time a gleam of anger shone in Thresk's eyes. "You have got me to your house by a trick. You have abused your position as my host. And but that I should injure a woman whom life has done nothing but injure, I should go out of your door this instant." He turned his back upon Harold Hazlewood and sat down in a chair opposite to Robert Pettifer. A little round table separated them. Pettifer, seated upon a couch, took from his pocket the envelope with the press cuttings, and spread them on the table in front of him. Thresk lolled back in his chair. It was plain that he was in no terror of Pettifer's examination. "I am at your service," he said. End of chapter 23. Chapters 24 and 25 of The Witness for the Defense by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24 The Witness. The afternoon sunlight poured into the room, golden and clear. Outside the open windows the garden was noisy with birds, and the river babbled between its banks. Henry Thresk shut his ears against the music. For all his appearance of ease, he dreaded the encounter which was now begun. Pettifer he knew to be a shrewd man. He watched him methodically arranging his press cuttings in front of him. Pettifer might well find some weak point in his story which he himself had not discovered, and, whatever course he was minded afterwards to take, here and now he was determined once more to fight Stella's battle. "I need not go back on the facts of the trial," said Pettifer. "They are fresh enough in your memory, no doubt. Your theory, as I understand it, ran as follows. While you were mounting your camel on the edge of the camp to return to the station, and Ballantyne was at your side, the thief whose arm you had both seen under the tent wall, not knowing that now you had the photograph of Bahadur Salak which he wished to steal, slipped into the tent unperceived, took up the rook rifle," which was standing by Mrs. Ballantyne's writing table, Thresk interposed. "Loaded it," the cartridges were lying open in a drawer, "and shot Ballantyne on his return." "Yes," Thresk agreed. "In addition, you must remember that when Captain Ballantyne was found an hour or so later, Mrs. Ballantyne was in bed and asleep." "Quite so," said Pettifer. "In brief, Mr. Thresk, you supplied a reasonable motive for the crime and some evidence of a criminal. And I admit that on your testimony the jury returned the only verdict which it was possible to give." "What troubles you, then?" Henry Thresk asked. And Pettifer replied dryly, "Various points. Here's one, a minor one. If Captain Ballantyne was shot by a thief detected in the act of thieving, why should that thief risk capture and death by dragging Captain Ballantyne's body out into the open? It seems to me the last thing which he would naturally do." Thresk shrugged his shoulders. "I can't explain that. It is perhaps possible that, not finding the photograph, he fell into a blind rage and satisfied it by violence towards the dead man." "Dead or dying," Mr. Pettifer corrected. "There seems to have been some little doubt upon that point. But your theory's a little weak, isn't it? To get away unseen would be that thief's first preoccupation, surely?" "Reasoning as you and I are doing here quietly, at our ease in this room, no doubt you are right, Mr. Pettifer. But criminals are caught because they don't reason quietly when they have just committed a crime. The behaviour of a man whose mind is influenced by that condition cannot be explained always by any laws of psychology. He may be in a wild panic. He may act as madmen act, or like a child in a rage. And if my explanation is weak, it's no weaker than the only other hypothesis, that Mrs. Ballantyne herself dragged him into the open." Mr. Pettifer shook his head. "I am not so sure. I can conceive a condition of horror in the wife, horror at what she had done, which would make that act not merely possible but almost inevitable. I make no claims to being an imaginative man, Mr. Thresk, but I try to put myself into the position of the wife." And he described with a vividness for which Thresk was not prepared the scene as he saw it. "She goes to bed. She undresses and goes to bed. She must do that if she is to escape. She puts out her light. She lies in the dark awake, and, under the same roof, close to her, in the dark too, is lying the man she has killed. Just a short passage separates her from him. There are no doors, mind that, Mr. Thresk, no doors to lock and bolt, merely a grass screen which you could lift with your forefinger. Wouldn't any and every one of the little cracks and sounds and breathings, of which the quietest and stillest night is full, sound to her like the approach of the dead man? The faintest breath of air would seem a draught made by the swinging of the grass curtain as it was stealthily lifted by the dead man. No, Mr. Thresk, the wife is just the one person I could imagine who would do that needless barbarous violence of dragging the body into the open, and she would do it, not out of cruelty, but because she must or go mad. Thresk listened without a movement until Robert Pettifer had finished. Then he said, "Do you know Mrs. Ballantyne? Has she the strength which she must have had to drag a heavy man across the carpet of a tent and fling him outside?" "Not now, not before. But just at the moment? You argued, Mr. Thresk, that it is impossible to foresee what people will do under the immediate knowledge that they have committed a capital crime. I agree. But I go a little further. I say that they will also exhibit a physical strength with which it would be otherwise impossible to credit them. Fear lends it to them." "Yes," Thresk interrupted quickly. "But don't you see, Mr. Pettifer, that you are implying the existence of an emotion in Mrs. Ballantyne which the facts prove her to have been without? Fear? Panic? She was found quietly asleep in her bed by the ayah when she came to call her in the morning. There's no doubt of that. The ayah was never for a moment shaken upon that point. The psychology of crime is a curious and surprising study, Mr. Pettifer, and I know of no case where terror has acted as a sleeping draught." Mr. Pettifer smiled and turned altogether away from the question. "It is, as I said, a minor point, and perhaps one from which any sort of inference would be unsafe. It interested me. I lay no great stress upon it." He dismissed the point carelessly, to the momentary amusement of Henry Thresk. The art of slipping away from defeat had been practised with greater skill. Thresk lost some part of his apprehension, but none of his watchfulness. "Now, however, we come to something very different," said Pettifer, hitching himself a little closer to his table and fixing his eyes upon Thresk. "The case for the prosecution ran like this. Stephen Ballantyne was, though a man of great ability, a secret drunkard who humiliated his wife in public and beat her in private. She went in terror of him. She bore on more than one occasion the marks of his violence, and upon that night in Chitipur, perhaps in a panic, and very likely under extreme provocation, she snatched up her rook rifle and put an end to the whole bad business." "Yes," Thresk agreed. "That was the case for the Crown." "Yes, and throughout the sittings at the stipendiaries' inquiry before you came upon the scene, that theory was clearly developed." "Yes." Thresk's confidence vanished as quickly as it had come. He realised whither Pettifer's questions were leading. There was a definitely weak link in his story, and Pettifer had noticed it and was testing it. "Now," the solicitor continued, "and this is the important point, what was the answer to that charge foreshadowed by the defence during those days before you appeared?" Thresk answered the question quickly, if answer it could be called. "The defence had not formulated any answer. I came forward before the case for the Crown finished." "Quite so. But Mrs. Ballantyne's counsel did cross-examine the witnesses for the prosecution. We must not forget that, Mr. Thresk. And from the cross-examination it is quite clear what answer he was going to make. He was going, not to deny that Mrs. Ballantyne shot her husband, but to plead that she had shot him in self-defence." "Oh?" said Thresk. "And where do you find that?" He had no doubt himself in what portion of the report of the trial a proof of Pettifer's statement was to be discovered, but he made a creditable show of surprise that any one should hold that opinion at all. Pettifer selected a column of newspapers from his cuttings. "Listen," he said. "Mr. Repton, a friend of Mrs. Ballantyne, was called upon a subpoena by the Crown, and he testified that while he was a collector at Agra he went up with his wife from the plains to the hill station of Mussoorie during a hot weather. The Ballantynes went up at the same time and occupied a bungalow next to Repton's. One night Repton's house was broken into. He went across to Ballantyne the next morning and advised him in the presence of his wife to sleep with a revolver under his pillow." "Yes, I remember that," said Thresk. He had indeed cause to remember it very well, for it was just this evidence given by Repton, with its clear implication of the line which the defence meant to take, that had sent him in a hurry to Mrs. Ballantyne's solicitor. Pettifer continued by reading Repton's words slowly and with emphasis. "Mrs. Ballantyne then turned very pale, and running after me down the garden like a distracted woman cried, 'Why did you tell him to do that? It will some night mean my death.' This statement, Mr. Thresk, was elicited in cross-examination by Mrs. Ballantyne's counsel, and it could only mean that he intended to set up a plea of self-defence. I find it a little difficult to reconcile that intention with the story you subsequently told." Henry Thresk, for his part, knew that it was not merely difficult. It was, in fact, impossible. Mr. Pettifer had read the evidence with an accurate discrimination. The plea of self-defence was here foreshadowed, and it was just the certainty that the defence was going to rely upon it for a verdict which had brought Henry Thresk himself into the witness box at Bombay. Given all that was known of Stephen Ballantyne and of the life he had led his unhappy wife, the defence would have been a good one, but for a single fact, the discovery of Ballantyne's body outside the tent. No plea of self-defence could safely be left to cover that. Thresk himself wondered at it. It struck at public sympathy. It seemed the act of a person insensate and vindictive. Therefore he had come forward with his story. But Mr. Pettifer was not to know it. "There are 3 things for you to remember," said Thresk. "In the first place, it is too early to assume that self-defence was going to be the plea. Assumptions in a case of this kind are very dangerous, Mr. Pettifer. They may lead to an irreparable injustice. We must keep to the fact that no plea of self-defence was ever formulated. In the second place, Mrs. Ballantyne was brought down to Bombay in a state of complete collapse. Her married life had been a torture to her. She broke down at the end of it. She was indifferent to anything that might happen." Pettifer nodded. "Yes, I can understand that." "It followed that her advisers had to act upon their own initiative." "And the third point?" Pettifer asked. "Well, it's not so much a point as an opinion of mine, but I hold it strongly. Her counsel mishandled the case." Pettifer pursed up his lips and grunted. He tapped a finger once or twice on the table in front of him. He looked towards Thresk as if all was not quite said. Harold Hazlewood, to whom the position of a neglected listener was rare and unpalatable, saw an opportunity for intervention. "The 3 points are perhaps not very conclusive," he said. Thresk turned towards him coldly. "I promised to answer such questions as Mr. Pettifer put to me. I am doing that. I did not undertake to discuss the value of my answers afterwards." No, quite so," murmured Mr. Hazlewood. "We are very grateful, I am sure." And he left once more the argument to Pettifer. "Then I come to the next question, Mr. Thresk. At some moment in this inquiry you, of your own account, put yourself into communication with Mrs. Ballantyne's advisers and volunteered your evidence?" "Yes." "Isn't it strange that the defence did not at the very outset get into communication with you?" "No," replied Thresk. Here he was at his ease. He had laid his plans well in Bombay. Mr. Pettifer might go on asking questions until midnight upon this point. Thresk could meet him. "It was not at all strange. It was not known that I could throw any light upon the affair at all. All that passed between Ballantyne and myself passed when we were alone, and Ballantyne was now dead." "Yes, but you had dined with the Ballantynes on that night. Surely it's strange that since you were in Bombay, Mrs. Ballantyne's advisers did not seek you out." "Yes, yes," added Mr. Hazlewood. "Very strange indeed, Mr. Thresk, since you were in Bombay." And he looked up at the ceiling and joined the tips of his fingers, his whole attitude a confident question. "Answer that if you can." Thresk turned patiently round. "Hasn't it occurred to you, Mr. Hazlewood, that it is still more strange that the prosecution did not at once approach me?" "Yes," said Pettifer suddenly. "That question, too, has troubled me." And Thresk turned back again. "You see," he explained, "I was not known to be in Bombay at all. On the contrary, I was supposed to be somewhere in the Red Sea or the Mediterranean on my way back to England." Mr. Pettifer looked up in surprise. The statement was news to him, and if true provided a natural explanation of some of his chief perplexities. "Let me understand that." And there was a change in his voice which Thresk was quick to detect. There was less hostility. "Certainly," Thresk answered. "I left the tent just before 11 to catch the Bombay mail. I was returning direct to England. The reason why Ballantyne asked me to take the photograph of Bahadur Salak was that since I was going on board straight from the train, it could be no danger to me." "Then why didn't you go straight on board?" asked Pettifer. "I'll tell you," Thresk replied. "I thought the matter over on the journey down to Bombay, and I came to the conclusion that since the photograph might be wanted at Salak's trial, I had better take it to the Governor's house at Bombay. But Government House is out at Malabar Point, 4 miles from the quays. I took the photograph out myself, and so I missed the boat. But there was an announcement in the papers that I had sailed, and in fact the consul at Marseilles came on board at that port to inquire for me on instructions from the Indian government." Mr. Pettifer leaned back. "Yes, I see," he said thoughtfully. "That makes a difference, a big difference." Then he sat upright again and said sharply, "You were in Bombay then when Mrs. Ballantyne was brought down from Chitipur?" "Yes." "And when the case for the Crown was started?" "Yes." "And when the Crown's witnesses were cross-examined?" "Yes." "Why did you wait then all that time before you came forward?" Pettifer put the question with an air of triumph. "Why, Mr. Thresk, did you wait till the very moment when Mrs. Ballantyne was going to be definitely committed to a particular line of defence before you announced that you could clear up the mystery? Doesn't it rather look as if you had remained hidden on the chance of prosecution breaking down, and had only come forward when you realized that tomorrow self-defence would be pleaded, the firing of that rook rifle admitted, and a terrible risk of a verdict of guilty run?" Thresk agreed without a moment's hesitation. "But that's the truth, Mr. Pettifer," he said, and Mr. Pettifer sprang up. "What?" "Consider my position." Thresk drew up his chair close to the table. "A barrister who was beginning to have one of the large practices, the courts opening in London, briefs awaiting me, cases on which I had already advised coming on. I had already lost a fortnight. That was bad enough, but if I came forward with my story, I must wait in Bombay not merely for a fortnight, but until the whole trial was completed, as in the end I had to do. Of course I hoped that the prosecution would break down. Of course I didn't intervene until it was absolutely necessary in the interests of justice that I should." He spoke so calmly, and there was so much reason in what he said, that Pettifer could not but be convinced. "I see," he said. "I see. Yes, that's not to be disputed." He remained silent for a few moments. Then he shuffled his papers together and replaced them in the envelope. It seemed that his examination was over. Thresk rose from his chair. "You have no more questions to ask me?" he inquired. "One more. Pettifer came round the table and stood in front of Henry Thresk. "Did you know Mrs. Ballantyne before you went to Chitipur?" "Yes," Thresk replied. "Had you seen her lately?" "No." "When had you last seen her?" 8 years before, in this neighbourhood. I spent a holiday close by. Her father and mother were then alive. I had not seen her since. I did not even know that she was in India and married until I was told so in Bombay." Thresk was prepared for that question. He had the truth ready, and he spoke it frankly. Mr. Pettifer turned away to Hazlewood, who was watching him expectantly. "We have nothing more to do, Hazlewood, but to thank Mr. Thresk for answering our questions, and to apologize to him for having put them." Mr. Hazlewood was utterly disconcerted. After all, then, the marriage must take place? The plot had ignominiously failed. The great questions which were to banish Stella Ballantyne from Little Beeding had been put and answered. He sat like a man stricken by calamity. He stammered out reluctantly a few words to which Thresk paid little heed. "You are satisfied, then?" he asked of Pettifer. And Pettifer showed him unexpectedly a cordial and good-humoured face. "Yes. Let me say to you, Mr. Thresk, that ever since I began to study this case I have wished less and less to bear hardly upon Mrs. Ballantyne. As I read those columns of evidence the heavy figure of Stephen Ballantyne took life again, but a very sinister life. And when I look at Stella and think of what she went through during the years of her married life, while we were comfortably here at home, I cannot but feel a shiver of discomfort. Yes, I am satisfied, and I am glad that I am satisfied." And with a smile which suddenly illumined his dry, parched face, he held out his hand to Henry Thresk. It was perhaps as well that the questions were over, for even while Pettifer was speaking, Stella's voice was heard in the hall. Pettifer had just time to thrust away the envelope with the cuttings into a drawer before she came into the room with Dick. She had been forced to leave the three men together, but she had dreaded it. During that 1 hour of absence she had lived through a lifetime of terror and anxiety. What would Thresk tell them? What was he now telling them? She was like one waiting downstairs while a surgical operation is being performed in the theatre above. She had hurried Dick back to Little Beeding, and when she came into the room her eyes roamed round in suspense from Thresk to Hazlewood, from Hazlewood to Pettifer. She saw the tray of miniatures upon the table. "You admire the collection?" she said to Thresk. "Very much," he answered, and Pettifer took her by the arm, and in a voice of kindness which she had never heard him use before, he said, "Now, tell me about your house. That's much more interesting." Chapter 25 in the library. Henry Thresk took Mrs. Pettifer in to dinner that night, and she found him poor company. He tried indeed by fits and starts to entertain her, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was in a great pother and trouble about Stella Ballantyne, who sat over against him on the other side of the table. She wore no traces of the consternation which his words had caused her a couple of hours before. She had come dressed in a slim gown of shimmering blue, with her small head erect, a smile upon her lips, and a bright colour in her cheeks. Thresk hardly knew her. He had to tell himself again and again that this was the Stella Ballantyne whom he had known here and in India. She was not the girl who had ridden with him upon the Downs and made 1 month of his life very memorable and one day a shameful recollection. Nor was she the stricken creature of the tent in Chitipur. She was a woman sure of her resources, radiant in her beauty, confident that what she wore was her colour and gave her her value. Yet her trouble was greater than Thresk's, and many a time during the course of that dinner, when she felt his eyes resting upon her, her heart sank in fear. She sought his company after dinner, but she had no chance of a private word with him. Old Mr. Hazlewood took care of that. One moment Stella must sing, at another she must play a rubber of bridge. He, at all events, had not laid aside his enmity, and suspected some understanding between her and his guest. At 11 Mrs. Pettifer took her leave. She came across the room to Henry Thresk. "Are you staying over to-morrow?" she asked, and Thresk, with a laugh, answered, "I wish that I could, but I have to catch an early train to London. Even to-night my day's work's not over. I must sit up for an hour or two over a brief." Stella rose at the same time as Mrs. Pettifer. "I was hoping that you would be able to come across and see my little cottage to-morrow morning," she said. Thresk hesitated as he took her hand. "I should very much like to see it," he said. He was in a very great difficulty, and was not sure that a letter was not the better if the more cowardly way out of it. "If I could find the time." "Try," said she. She could say no more, for Mr. Hazlewood was at her elbow, and Dick was waiting to take her home. It was a dark, clear night. A sky of stars overarched the earth, but there was no moon, and though light shone brightly even at a great distance, there was no glimmer from the road beneath their feet. Dick held her close in his arms at the door of her cottage. She was very still and passive. "You are tired?" he asked. "I think so." "Well, to-night has seen the last of our troubles, Stella." She did not answer him at once. Her hands clung about his shoulders, and with her face smothered in his coat she whispered, "Dick, I couldn't go on without you now. I couldn't. I wouldn't." There was a note of passionate despair in her voice which made her words suddenly terrible to him. He took her and held her a little away from him, peering into her face. "What are you saying, Stella?" he asked sternly. "You know that nothing can come between us. You break my heart when you talk like that." He drew her again into his arms. "Is your maid waiting up for you?" "No." "Call her, then, while I wait here. Let me see the light in her room. I want her to sleep with you to-night." "There's no need, Dick," she answered. "I am unstrung to-night. I said more than I meant. I swear to you there's no need." He raised his head and kissed her on the lips. "I trust you, Stella," he said gently, and she answered him in a low trembling voice of so much tenderness and love that he was reassured. "Oh, you may, my dear, you may." She went up to her room and turned on the light, and sat down in her chair just as she had done after her first dinner at Little Beeding. She had foreseen then all the troubles which had since beset her, but she had seemed to have passed through them until this afternoon. Over there in the library of the big house was Henry Thresk, the stranger. Very likely he was at this moment writing to her. If he had only consented to come over in the morning and give her a chance of pleading with him! She went to the window and, drawing up the blind, leaned her head out and looked across the meadow. In the library one of the long windows stood open, and the curtain was not drawn. The room was full of light. Henry Thresk was there. He had befriended her this afternoon as he had befriended her at Bombay. For the second time he had won the victory for her, but the very next moment he had warned her that the end was not yet. He would send her a letter. She had not a doubt of it. She had not a doubt either of the message which the letter would bring. A sound rose to her ears from the gravel path below her window, the sound of a slight, involuntary movement. Stella drew sharply back. Then she leaned out again and called softly, "Dick!" He was standing a little to the left of the window, out of reach of the light which streamed out upon the darkness from the room behind her. He moved forward now. "Oh, Dick, why are you waiting?" "I wanted to be sure that all was right, Stella." "I gave you my word, Dick," she whispered, and she wished him good night again and waited till the sound of his footsteps had altogether died away. He went back to the house and found Thresk still at work in the library. "I don't want to interrupt you," he said, "but I must thank you again. I can't tell you what I owe you. She's pretty wonderful, isn't she? I feel coarse beside her, I tell you. I couldn't talk like this to anyone else, but you're so sympathetic." Henry Thresk had responded with nothing more than a grunt. He sat slashing at his brief with a blue pencil all the while that Dick Hazlewood was speaking, and wishing that he would go to bed. Dick, however, was unabashed. "Did you ever see a woman look so well in a blue frock? Or in a black one either? There's a sort of painted thing she wears sometimes too. Well, perhaps I had better go to bed." "I think it would be wise," said Thresk. Young Hazlewood went over to the table in the corner and lit his candle. "You'll shut that window before you go to bed, won't you?" "Yes." Hazlewood filled for himself a glass of barley water and drank it, contemplating Henry Thresk over the rim. Then he went back to him, carrying his candle in his hand. "Why don't you get married, Mr. Thresk?" he asked. "You ought to, you know. Men run to seed so if they don't." "Thank you," said Thresk. The tone was not cordial, but mere words were an invitation to Dick Hazlewood at this moment. He sat down and placed his lighted candle on the table between Thresk and himself. "I am 34 years old," he said, and Thresk interposed without glancing up from his foolscap. "From your style of conversation I find that very difficult to believe, Captain Hazlewood." "I have wasted 34 complete years of 12 months each," continued the ecstatic captain, who appeared to think that on the very day of his birth he would have recognized his soul's mate. "Just jogging along with the world, a miracle about one, and not half an eye to perceive it. You know." "No, I don't," Thresk observed. He lifted the candle and held it out to Dick. Dick got up and took it. "Thank you," he said. "That was very kind of you. I told you, didn't I, how sympathetic I thought you?" Thresk was not proof against his companion's pertinacity. He broke into a laugh. "Are you going to bed?" he pleaded, and Dick Hazlewood replied, "Yes, I am." Suddenly his tone changed. "Stella had a very good friend in you, Mr. Thresk. I am sure she still has one." And without waiting for any answer he went upstairs. His bedroom was near to the front in the side of the house. It commanded a view of the meadow and the cottage, and he rejoiced to see that all Stella's windows were dark. The library was out of sight round the corner at the back, but a glare of light from the open door spread out over the lawn. Hazlewood looked at his watch. It was just midnight. He went to bed and slept. In the library Thresk strove to concentrate his thoughts upon his brief. But he could not, and he threw it aside at last. There was a letter to be written, and until it was written and done with, his thoughts would not be free. He went over to the writing table and wrote it, but it took a long while in the composition, and the clock upon the top of the stable was striking 1 when at last he had finished and sealed it up. "I'll post it in the morning at the station," he resolved, and he went to the window to close it. But as he touched it a slight figure wrapped in a dark cloak came out of the darkness at the side and stepped past him into the room. He swung round and saw Stella Ballantyne. "You!" he exclaimed. "You must be mad." "I had to come," she said, standing well away from the window in the centre of the room, as though she thought he would drive her out. "I heard you say you would be sitting late here." "How long have you been waiting out there?" "A little while. I don't know. Not very long. I wasn't sure that you were alone." Thresk closed the window and drew the curtain across it. Then he crossed the room and locked the doors leading into the dining room and the hall. "There was no need for you to come," he said in a low voice. "I have written to you." "Yes," she nodded her head. "That's why I had to come. This afternoon you spoke of leaving your pipe behind. I understood," and as he drew the letter from his pocket she recoiled from it. "No, it has never been written. I came in time to prevent its being written. You only had an idea of writing. Say that. You are my friend." She took the letter from him now and tore it across and again across. "See, it has never been written at all." But Thresk only shook his head. "I am very sorry. I see tonight the stricken woman of the tent in Chitipur. I am very sorry." And Stella caught at the commiseration in his voice. She dropped the cloak from her shoulders. She was dressed as she had been at dinner some hours before, but all her radiance had gone, her cheeks trembled, and her eyes pleaded desperately. "Sorry? I knew you would be. You are not hard. You couldn't be. You must come close day by day in your life to so much that is pitiful. One can talk to you and you'll understand. This is my first chance, the first real chance I ever had, Henry, the very first." Thresk looked backwards over the years of Stella Ballantyne's unhappy life. It came upon him with a shock that what she said was the bare truth, and remorse followed hard upon the heels of the shock. This was her first real chance, and he himself was to blame that it had come no earlier. The first chance of a life worth the living. It had been in his hands to give her, and he had refused to give it years ago on Bignor Hill. "It's quite true," he admitted, "but I don't ask you to give it up, Stella." She looked at him eagerly. "No, you would have understood that if you had read my letter instead of tearing it up. I only ask you to tell your lover the truth." "He knows it," she said sullenly. "No." He does," she protested, her voice rising to a low cry. "Hush! You'll be heard," said Thresk, and she listened for a moment anxiously. But there was no sound of any one stirring in the house. "We are safe here," she said. "No one sleeps above us. Henry, he knows the truth." "Would you be here now if he did?" "I came because this afternoon you seemed to be threatening me. I didn't understand. I couldn't sleep. I saw the light in this room. I came to ask you what you meant. That's all." "I'll tell you what I meant," said Thresk, and Stella, with her eyes fixed upon him, sank down upon a chair. "I left my pipe behind me in the tent on the night I dined with you. Your lover, Stella, doesn't know that. I came back to fetch it. He doesn't know that. You were standing by the table," and Stella Ballantyne broke in upon him to silence the words upon his lips. "There was no reason why he should know," she exclaimed. "It had nothing to do with what happened. We know what happened. There was a thief." And Thresk turned to her then with such a look of sheer amazement upon his face that she faltered and her voice died to a murmur of words. "A lean brown arm. A hand as delicate as a woman's." "There was no thief," he said quietly. "There was a man delirious with drink who imagined one. There was you with the bruises on your throat and the unutterable misery in your eyes and a little rifle in your hands. There was no one else." She ceased to argue. She sat looking straight in front of her with a stubborn face and a resolution to cling at all costs to her chance of happiness. "Come, Stella," Thresk pleaded. "I don't say tell every one. I do say tell him. For unless you do, I must." Stella stared at him. "You?" she said. "You would tell him that you came back into the tent and saw me?" "Oh, much more. That I lied at the trial, that the story which secured your acquittal was false, that I made it up to save you, that I told it again this afternoon to give you a chance of slipping out from an impossible position." She looked at Thresk for a moment in terror. Then her expression changed. A wave of relief swept over her. She laughed in Thresk's face. "You are trying to frighten me," she said. "Only I know you. Do you realise what it would mean to you if it were ever really known that you had lied at the trial?" "Yes." "Your ruin, your absolute ruin." "Worse than that." "Prison." "Perhaps. Yes." Stella laughed again. "And you would run the risk of the truth becoming known by telling it to so much as one person?" No, no. Another, perhaps. Not you. You have had one dream all your life, to rise out of obscurity, to get on in the world, to hold the highest positions. Everything and every one has been sacrificed to its fulfillment. Oh, who should know better than I?" And she struck her hands together sharply as she uttered that bitter cry. "You have lain down late and risen early, and you have got on. Well, are you the man to throw away all this work and success now that they touch fulfillment? You are in the chariot. Will you step down and run tied to the wheels? Will you stand up and say, 'There was a trial. I perjured myself'? No. Another, perhaps. Not you, Henry." Thresk had no answer to that indictment. All of it was true except its inference, and it was no news to him. He made no effort to defend himself. "You are not very generous, Stella," he replied gently. "For if I lied, I saved you by the lie." Stella was softened by the words. Her voice lost its hardness. She reached out her hand in an apology and laid it on his arm. "Oh, I know. I sent you a little word of thanks when you gave me my freedom. But it won't be of much value to me if I lose what I am fighting for now." "So you use every weapon?" "Yes." "But this one breaks in your hand," he said firmly. "The thing you think it incredible that I should do, I shall do none the less." Stella looked at him in despair. She could no longer doubt that he really meant his words. He was really resolved to make this sacrifice of himself and her. And why? Why should he interfere? "You save me one day to destroy me the next," she said. "No," he replied. "I don't think I shall do that, Stella." And he explained to her what drove him on. "I had no idea why Hazel would ask me here. Had I suspected it, I say frankly that I should have refused to come. But I am here. The trouble's once more at my door, but in a new shape. There's this man, young Hazlewood. I can't forget him. You will be marrying him by the help of a lie I told." "He loves me!" she cried. "Then he can bear the truth," answered Thresk. He pulled up a chair opposite to that in which Stella sat. "I want you to understand me, if you will. I don't want you to think me harsh or cruel. I told a lie upon my oath in the witness box. I violated my traditions. I struck at my belief in the value of my own profession, and such beliefs mean a good deal to any man." Stella stirred impatiently. What words were these? Traditions. The value of a profession. "I am not laying stress upon them, Stella, but they count," Thresk continued. "And I am telling you that they count because I am going to add that I should tell that lie again tomorrow, were the trial tomorrow and you a prisoner. I should tell it again to save you again. Yes, to save you. But when you go and, let me put it very plainly, use that lie to your advantage, why then I am bound to cry stop. Don't you see that? You are using the lie to marry a man and keep him in ignorance of the truth. You can't do that, Stella. You would be miserable yourself if you did all your life. You would never feel safe for a moment. You would be haunted by a fear that some day he would learn the truth and not from you. Oh, I am sure of it." He caught her hands and pressed them earnestly. "Tell him, Stella. Tell him." Stella Ballantyne rose to her feet with a strange look upon her face. Her eyes half closed as though to shut out a vision of past horrors. She turned to Thresk with a white face and her hands tightly clenched. "You don't know what happened on that night after you rode away to catch your train?" "No." "I think you ought to know before you sit in judgment." And so at last in that quiet library under the Sussex Downs the tragic story of that night was told. For Thresk, as he listened and watched, its terrors lived again in the eyes and the hushed voice of Stella Ballantyne. The dark walls seemed to fall back and dissolve. The moonlit plain of far-away Chittipur stretched away in front of him to the dim hill where the old silent palaces crumbled, and midway between them and the green signal lights of the railway the encampment blazed like the clustered lights of a small town. But Thresk learned more than the facts. The springs of conduct were disclosed to him, the woman revealed herself, dark places were made light, and he bowed himself beneath a new burden of remorse. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Witness for the Defence by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Two Strangers. You came back to the tent, she began, and ever since then you have misunderstood what you saw. For this is the truth. I was going to kill myself. Thresk was startled as he had not expected to be, and a great wave of relief swept over him and uplifted his soul. Here was the simplest explanation, yet it had never occurred to him. Always he had been besieged by the vision of Stella standing quietly by the table, deliberately preparing her rifle for use. Always he had linked up that vision with the death of Stephen Ballantyne in a dreadful connection. He did not doubt that she spoke the truth now. Looking at her and noticing the anguish of her face, he could not doubt it. So definite a premeditation as he had imagined there had not been, and relief carried him to pity. So it had come to that, he said. Yes, replied Stella, and you had your share in bringing it to that, you who sit in judgment. I? Thresk exclaimed. Yes, you who sit in judgment. I am not alone. No, I am not alone. A crime was committed? Then you must shoulder your portion of the blame. Thresk asked himself in vain what was his share. He had done a cowardly thing years ago a few miles from this spot. He had never ceased to reproach himself for the cowardice, but that it had lived and worked like some secret malady until in the end it had made him an all unconscious accomplice in that midnight tragedy, a sharer in its guilt, if guilt there were. Here again was news for him. But the knowledge which her first words had given to him, that all these years he had never got the truth of her, kept him humble now. He ceased to be judge. He became pupil, and as pupil he answered her. I am ready to shoulder it. He was seated on a cushioned bench which stood behind the writing table, and Stella sat down at his side. When we parted, that morning, it was in the drawing-room over there in my cottage. We parted, you to your work of getting on, Henry, I to think of you getting on without me at your side. There was a letter lying on the table, a letter from India. Jane Repton had written it, and she asked me to go out to her for the cold weather. I went. I was a young girl, lonely and very unhappy, and as young girls often do who are lonely and very unhappy, I drifted into marriage. I see, said Thresk in a hushed voice. The terrible conviction grew upon him now, lurid as the breaking of a day of storm, that the cowardice he had shown on Bignor Hill ruined her altogether and hurt him not at all. Yes, I see. There my share begins. Oh, no, not yet, she answered. Then I spoke when I should have kept silence. I let my heart go out when I should have guarded it. No, I cannot blame you. But you have the right none the less. But Stella would not excuse herself now and to him by any subtlety or artifice. No, I married. That was my affair. I was beaten, despised, ridiculed, terrified by a husband who drank secretly and kept all his drunkenness for me. That too was my affair. But I might have gone on. For 7 years it had lasted. I was settling into a dull habit of misery. I might have gone on being bullied and tortured had not one little thing happened to push me over the precipice." "And what was that?" asked Thresk. "Your visit to me at Chitipur," she replied, and the words took his breath away. Why, he had travelled to Chitipur merely to save her! He leaned forward eagerly, but she anticipated him. She smiled at him with an indulgent forgiveness. "Oh, why did you come? But I know." "Do you?" Thresk asked. Here, at all events, she was wrong. "Yes, you came because of that one weak, soft spot of sentimentalism there is in all of you, the strongest, the hardest. You are strong for years, you live alone for years. Then comes the sentimental moment, and it's we who suffer, not you." And deep in Thresk's mind was the terror of the mistakes people make in ignorance of each other, and of the mortal hurt the mistakes inflict. He had misread Stella. Here she was misreading him, and misreading him in some strange way to her peril and ruin. "You are sure of that?" he asked. She had no doubt, no more doubt than he had had of the reason why she stood preparing her rifle. "Quite," she answered. "You had heard of me in Bombay, and it came over you that you would like to see how the woman you had loved looked after all these years, whether she retained her pretty way, whether she missed you, above all, whether she missed you. You wanted to fan up into a mild, harmless flame the ashes of an old romance, warm your hands at it for half an hour, recapture a savour of dim and pleasant memories, and then go back to your own place and your own work, untouched and unhurt." Thresk laughed aloud with bitterness at the mistake she had made. Yet he could not blame her. There was a certain shrewd insight which, though it had led her astray in this case, might well have been true in any other case, might well have been true of him. He remembered her disbelief in all that he had said to her in that tent at Chitipur, and he was appalled by the irony of things and the blind and feeble helplessness of men to combat it. "So that's why I came to Chitipur?" he cried. "Yes," Stella answered without a second of hesitation. "But I couldn't be left untouched and unhurt. You came, and all that I had lost came with you, came in a vivid rush of bright, intolerable memories." She clasped her hands over her eyes, and Thresk lived over again that evening in the tent upon the desert, but with a new understanding. His mind was illumined. He saw the world as a prison in which each living being is shut off from his neighbour by the impenetrable wall of an inability to understand. "Memories of summers here," she resumed, "of women friends, of dainty and comfortable things, and days of great happiness when it was good, oh so very good, to be alive and young. And you were going back to it all, straight by the night mail to Bombay, straight from the station on board your ship. Oh, how it hurt to hear you speak of it with a casual pleasant word about exile and next-door neighbours." She clasped her hands together in front of her. Her fingers worked and twisted. "No, I couldn't endure it," she whispered. "The blows, the ridicule, the contempt I determined should come to an end that night. And when you saw me with the rifle in my hand, I was going to end it." "Yes?" "And then the stupidest thing happened. I couldn't find the little box of cartridges." Stella described to him how she had run hither and thither about the tent, opening drawers, looking into bags, and growing more nervous and more flurried with every second that passed. She had so little time. Ballantyne was not going as far as the station with Thresk. He merely intended to see his visitor off beyond the edge of the camp. And it must be all over and done with before he came back. She heard Ballantyne call to Thresk to sit firm while the camel rose, and still she had not found them. She heard Thresk's voice saying good night. "The last words, Henry, I wanted to hear in the world. I thought that I would wait for them, and that the moment they had died away, then. But I hadn't found the cartridges, and so the search began again." Thresk, watching her as she lived through again those desperate minutes, was carried back to Chitipur and seemed to be looking into that tent. He had a dreadful picture before his eyes of a hunted woman rushing wildly from table to table, with a white quivering face, and lips which babbled incoherently, and feverish hands which darted out nervously, oversetting books and ornaments, in a vain search for a box of cartridges wherewith to kill herself. She found them at last behind the whisky bottle, and clutched at them with a great sigh of relief. She carried them over to the table on which she had laid her rifle, and as she pushed one into the breech, Stephen Ballantyne stood in the doorway of the tent. "He swore at me," Stella continued. "I had taken the necklace off. I had shown you the bruises on my throat. He cursed me for it, and he asked me roughly why I didn't shoot myself and rid him of a fool. I stood without answering him. That always maddened him. I didn't do it on purpose. I had become dull and slow. I just stood and looked at him stupidly, and in a fury he ran at me with his fist raised. I recoiled, he frightened me, and then before he reached me, yes." Her voice died away in a whisper. Thresk did not interrupt. There was more for her to tell, and one dreadful incident to explain. Stella went on in a moment, looking straight in front of her, and with all the passion of fear gone from her voice. "I remember that he stood and stared at me foolishly for a little while. I had time to believe that nothing had happened, and to be glad that nothing had happened, and to be terrified of what he would do to me. And then he fell and lay quite still." It seemed that she had no more to say, that she meant to leave unexplained the inexplicable thing, and even Thresk put it out of his thoughts. "It was an accident then," he cried. "After all, Stella, it was an accident." But Stella sat mutely at his side. Some struggle was taking place in her, and was reflected in her countenance. Thresk's eager joy was damped. "No, my friend," she said at length, slowly and very deliberately, "it was not an accident." "But you fired in fear." Thresk caught now at that alternative. "You shot in self-defence, Stella. I blundered at Bombay." He moved away from her in his agitation. "I am sorry. Oh, I am very sorry. I should never have come forward at all. I should have lain quiet and let your counsel develop his case as he was doing, on the line of self-defence. You would have been acquitted, and rightly acquitted. You would have had the sympathy of every one. But I didn't know your story. I was afraid that the discovery of Ballantyne outside the tent would ruin you. I knew that my story could not fail to save you. So I told it. But I was wrong, Stella. I blundered. I did you a great harm." He was standing before her now, and so poignant an anguish rang in his voice that Stella was moved by it to discard her plans. Thus she had meant to tell the story, if ever she was driven to it. Thus she had told it. But now she put out a timid hand and took him by the arm. "I said I would tell you the truth, but I have not told it all. It's so hard not to keep one little last thing back. Listen to me." And with a bowed head and her hand still clinging desperately to his arm, she made the final revelation. "It's true I was crazy with fear. But there was just one little moment when I knew what I was going to do, when it came upon me that the way I had chosen before was the wrong one, and this new way the right one. No, no," she cried as Thresk moved, "even that's not all. That moment, you could hardly measure it in time. Yet to me it was distinct enough, and is marked distinctly in my memories, for during it he drew back." "What?" cried Thresk. "Don't say it, Stella." "Yes," she answered. "During it he drew back, knowing what I was going to do, just as I suddenly knew it. It was a moment when he seemed to me to bleat, yes, that's the word, to bleat for mercy." She had told the truth now, and she dropped her hand from his sleeve. "And you, what did you do?" asked Thresk. "I? Oh, I went mad, I think. When I saw him lying there, I lost my head. The tent was flecked with great spots of fire which whirled in front of my eyes and hurt. A strength far greater than mine possessed me. I was crazy. I dragged him out of the tent for no reason. That's the truth. For no reason at all. Can you believe that?" "Yes," replied Thresk readily enough. "I can well believe that." "Then something broke," she resumed. "I felt weak and numbed. I dragged myself to my room. I went to bed. Does that sound very horrible to you? I had one clear thought only. It was over. It was all over. I slept." She leaned back in her chair, her hands dropped to her side, her eyes closed. "Yes, I did actually sleep." A clock ticking upon the mantel-shelf seemed to grow louder and louder in the silence of the library. The sound of it forced itself upon Thresk. It roused Stella. She opened her eyes. In front of her Thresk was standing, his face grave and very pitiful. "Now answer me truly," said Stella, and leaning forward she fixed her eyes upon him. "If you still loved me, would you, knowing this story, refuse to marry me?" Thresk looked back across the years of her unhappy life and saw her as the sport of a malicious destiny. "No," he said, "I should not." "Then why shouldn't Dick marry me?" "Because he doesn't know this story." Stella nodded her head. "Yes, there's the flaw in my appeal to you, I know. You are quite right. I should have told him. I should tell him now." And suddenly she dropped on her knees before Thresk. The tears burst from her eyes, and in a voice broken with passion she cried, "But I daren't, not yet. I have tried to, oh, more than once. Believe that, Henry. You must believe it. But I couldn't. I hadn't the courage. You will give me a little time, won't you? Oh, not long. I will tell him of my own free will. Very soon, Henry. But not now. Not now." The sound of her sobbing and the sight of her distress wrung Thresk's heart. He lifted her from the ground and held her. "There's another way, Stella," he said gently. "Oh, I know," she answered. She was thinking of the little bottle with the tablets of veronal which stood by her bed, not for the first time that night. She did not stop to consider whether Thresk too had that way in his mind. It came to her so naturally, it was so easy, so simple a way. She never thought that she misunderstood. She had come to the end of the struggle. The battle had gone against her. She recognized it. And now, without complaint, she bowed her head for the final blow. The inherited habit of submission taught her that the moment had come for compliance, and gave her the dignity of patience. "Yes, I suppose that I must take that way," she said, and she walked towards the chair over which she had thrown her wrap. "Good night, Henry." But before she had thrown the cloak about her shoulders, Thresk stood between her and the window. He took the cloak from her hands. "There have been too many mistakes, Stella, between you and me. There must be no more. Here are we, until tonight strangers, and because we were strangers and never knew it, spoiling each other's lives." Stella looked at him in bewilderment. She had taught Thresk that night unimagined truths about herself. She was now to learn something of the inner secret man which the outward trappings of success concealed. He led her to a sofa and placed her at his side. "You have said a good many hard things to me, Stella," he said with a smile. "Most of them true, but some untrue. And the untrue things you wouldn't have said if you had ever chanced to ask yourself one question: why I really missed my steamer at Bombay." Stella Ballantyne was startled. She made a guess but faltered in the utterance of it, so ill it fitted with her estimate of him. "You missed it on purpose?" "Yes. I didn't come to Chitipur on any sentimental journey." And he told her how he had seen her portrait in Jane Repton's drawing room and learned of the misery of her marriage. I came to fetch you away." And again Stella stared at him. "You? You pitied me so much? Oh, Henry!" "No, I wanted you so much. It's quite true that I sacrificed everything for success. I don't deny that it is well worth having. But Jane Repton said something to me in Bombay so true. You can get whatever you want if you want it enough, but you cannot control the price you will have to pay. I know, my dear, that I paid too big a price. I trampled down something better worth having." Stella rose suddenly to her feet. "Oh, if I had known that on the night in Chitipur, what a difference it would have made!" She turned swiftly to him. "Couldn't you have told me?" "I hadn't a chance. I hadn't 5 minutes with you alone. And you wouldn't have believed me if I had had the chance. I left my pipe behind me in order to come back and tell you. I had only the time then to tell you that I would write." "Yes, yes," she answered, and again the cry burst from her. "What a difference it would have made, merely to have known that you really wanted me!" She would never have taken that rifle from the corner and searched for the cartridges that she might kill herself. Whether she had consented or not to go away and ruin Thresk's future, she would have had a little faith wherewith to go on and face the world. If she had only known! But up on top of Bignor Hill a blow had been struck under which her faith had reeled, and it had never had a chance of recovery. She laughed harshly. The heart of her tragedy was now revealed to her. She saw herself the sport of gods, who sat about like cruel louts, torturing a helpless animal and laughing stupidly at its sufferings. She turned again to Thresk and held out her hand. "Thank you. You would have ruined yourself for me." "Ruin's a large word," he answered, and still holding her hand he drew her down again. She yielded reluctantly. She might misread his character, but when the feelings and emotions were aroused she had the unerring insight of her sex. She was warned by it now. She looked at Thresk with startled eyes. "Why have you told me all this?" she asked in suspense, ready for flight. "I want to prepare you. There's a way out of the trouble, the honest way for both of us. To make a clean breast of it together, and together take what follows." She was on her feet and away from him in a second. "No, no!" she cried in alarm, and Thresk mistook the cause of the alarm. "You can't be tried again, Stella. That's over. You have been acquitted." She temporised. "But you?" "I?" and he shrugged his shoulders. "I take the consequences. I doubt if they would be so very heavy. There would be some sympathy. And afterwards it would be as though you had slipped down from Chitipur to Bombay and joined me as I had planned. We can make the best of our lives together." There was so much sincerity in his manner, so much simplicity she could not doubt him, and the immensity of the sacrifice he was prepared to make overwhelmed her. It was not merely scandal and the divorce court which he was ready to brave now. He had gone beyond the plan contemplated at Bombay. He was willing to go hand in hand with her into the outer darkness, laying down all that he had laboured for unsparingly. "You would do that for me?" she said. "Oh, you put me to shame!" and she covered her face with her hands. "You gave up your struggle for a footing in the world. That's what you want, isn't it?" He pleaded, and she drew her hands away from her face. He believed that? He imagined that she was fighting just for a name, a position in the world? She stared at him in amazement and forced herself to understand. Since he himself had cared for her enough to remain unmarried, since the knowledge of the mistake which he had made had grown more bitter with each year, he had fallen easily into that other error that she had never ceased to care too. "We'll make something of our lives, never fear," he was saying. "But to marry this man for his position, and he not knowing. Oh, my dear, I know how you are driven, but it won't do. It won't do." She stood in silence for a little while. One by one he had torn her defences down. She could hardly bear the gentleness upon his face, and she turned away from him and sat down upon a chair a little way off. "Stand there, Henry," she said. A strange composure had succeeded her agitation. "I must tell you something more which I meant to hide from you, the last thing which I have kept back. It will hurt you, I'm afraid." There came a change upon Thresk's face. He was steeling himself to meet a blow. "Go on." "It isn't because of his position that I cling to Dick. I want him to keep that, yes, for his sake. I don't want him to lose more by marrying me than he needs must." And comprehension burst upon Henry Thresk. "You care for him, then? You really care for him?" "So much," she answered, "that if I lost him now I should lose all the world. You and I can't go back to where we stood 9 years ago. You had your chance then, Henry, if you had wished to take it. But you didn't wish it, and that sort of chance doesn't often come again. Others like it, yes, but not quite the same one. I am sorry, but you must believe me. If I lost Dick, I should lose all the world." So far she had spoken very deliberately, but now her voice faltered. "That is my one poor excuse." The unexpected word roused Thresk to inquiry. "Excuse?" he asked, and with her eyes fixed in fear upon him she continued. "Yes, I meant Dick to marry me publicly. But I saw that his father shrank from the marriage. I grew afraid. I told Dick of my fears. He banished them. I let him banish them." "What do you mean?" Thresk asked. "We were married privately in London 5 days ago." Thresk uttered a low cry, and in a moment Stella was at his side, all her composure gone. "Oh, I know that it was wrong, but I was being hunted. They were all like a pack of wolves after me. Mr. Hazlewood had joined them. I was driven into a corner. I loved Dick. They meant to tear him from me without any pity. I clung. Yes, I clung." But Thresk thrust her aside. "You tricked him," he cried. "I didn't dare to tell him," Stella pleaded, wringing her hands. "I didn't dare to lose him." "You tricked him," Thresk repeated, and at the note of anger in his voice Stella found herself again. "You accuse and condemn me?" she asked quietly. "Yes, 1,000 times yes!" he exclaimed hotly, and she answered with another question winged on a note of irony. "Because I tricked him or because I married him?" Thresk was silenced. He recognised the truth implied in the distinction. He turned to her with a smile. "Yes," he answered. "You are right, Stella. It's because you married him." He stood for a moment in thought. Then with a gesture of helplessness he picked up her cloak. She watched his action, and as he came towards her she cried, "But I'll tell him now, Henry." In a way she owed it to this man who cared for her so much, who was so prepared for sacrifice, if sacrifice could help. That morning on the Downs was swept from her memory now. "Yes, I'll tell him now," she said eagerly. Since Henry Thresk set such store upon that confession, why so very likely would Dick, her husband, too. But Thresk shook his head. "What's the use now? You give him no chance. You can't set him free." And Stella was as one turned to stone. All argument seemed sooner or later to turn to that one dread alternative which had already twice that night forced itself on her acceptance. "Yes, I can, Henry, and I will, I promise you. If he wishes to be free, I can do it quite easily, quite naturally. Any woman could. So many of us take things to make us sleep." There was no boastfulness in her voice or manner, but rather a despairing recognition of facts. "Good God, you mustn't think of it," said Thresk eagerly. "That's too big a price to pay." Stella shook her head wistfully. "You hear it said, Henry," she answered with an indescribable wistfulness, "that women will do anything to keep the men they love. They'll do a great deal. I am an example. But not always everything. Sometimes love runs just a little stronger, and then it craves that the loved one shall get all he wants to have. If Dick wants his freedom, I too then shall want him to have it." and while Thresk stood with no words to answer her, there came a knocking upon the door. It was gentle, almost furtive, but it startled them both like a clap of thunder. For a moment they stood rigid. Then Thresk silently handed Stella her cloak and pointed towards the window. He began to speak aloud. A word or two revealed his plan to Stella Ballantyne. He was rehearsing a speech which he was to make in the courts before a jury. But the handle of the door rattled, and now old Mr. Hazlewood's voice was heard. "Thresk, are you there?" Once more Thresk pointed to the window, but Stella did not move. "Let him in," she said quietly, and with a glance at her he unlocked the door. Mr. Hazlewood stood outside. He had not gone to bed that night. He had taken off his coat and now wore a smoking jacket. "I knew that I should not sleep to-night, so I sat up," he began, "and I thought that I heard voices here." Over Thresk's shoulder he saw Stella Ballantyne standing erect in the middle of the room, her shining gown the one bright patch of colour. "You here?" he cried to her, and Thresk made way for him to enter. He advanced to her with a look of triumph in his eyes. "You here? At this house? With Thresk? You were persuading him to continue to hold his tongue." Stella met his gaze steadily. "No," she replied. "He was persuading me to the truth, and he has succeeded." Mr. Hazlewood smiled and nodded. There was no magnanimity in his triumph. A schoolboy would have shown more chivalry to the opponent who was down. "You confess, then? Good. Richard must be told." "Yes," answered Stella. "I claim the right to tell him." But Mr. Hazlewood scoffed at the proposal. "Oh dear no," he cried. "I refuse the claim. I shall go straight to Richard now." He had actually taken a couple of steps towards the door before Stella's voice rang out suddenly, loud and imperative. "Take care, Mr. Hazlewood. After you have told him he will come to me. Take care." Hazlewood stopped. Certainly that was true. "I'll tell Dick to-morrow, here, in your presence," she said, "and if he wishes it, I'll set him free and never trouble either of you again." Hazlewood looked at Thresk and was persuaded to consent. Reflection showed him that it was the better plan. He himself would be present when Stella spoke. He would see that the truth was told without embroidery. "Very well, to-morrow," he said. Stella flung the cloak over her shoulders and went up to the window. Thresk opened it for her. "I'll see you to your door," he said. The moon had risen now. It hung low, with the branches of a tree like a lattice across its face, and on the garden and the meadow lay that unearthly light which falls when a moonlit night begins to drown in the onrush of the dawn. "No," she said, "I would rather go alone. But do something for me, will you? Stay to-morrow. Be here when I tell him." She choked down a sob. "Oh, I shall want a friend, and you are so kind." "So kind," he repeated with a note of bitterness. Could there be praise from a woman's lips more deadly? "You are kind. You are put in your place in the ruck of men. You are extinguished." "Oh yes, I'll stay." She stood for a moment on the stone flags outside the window. "Will he forgive?" she asked. "You would. And he is not so very young, is he? It's the young who don't forgive. Good night." She went along the path and across the meadow. Thresk watched her go and saw the light spring up in her room. Then he closed the window and drew the curtain. Mr. Hazlewood had gone. Thresk wondered what the morrow would bring. After all, Stella was right. Youth was a graceful thing of high-sounding words and impetuous thoughts, but like many other graceful things it could be hard and cruel. Its generosity did not come from any wide outlook on a world where there is a good deal to be said for everything. It was rather a matter of physical health and judgment. Yes, he was glad Dick Hazlewood was half his way through the 30s. For himself, Well, he knew his business. It was to be kind. He turned off the lights and went to bed. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Witness for the Defense by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27, The Verdict. 6, 7, 8, said Mr. Hazlewood, counting the letters which he had already written since breakfast, and placing them on the salver which Hubbard was holding out to him. He was a very different man this morning from the Mr. Hazlewood of yesterday. He shone, complacent and serene. He leaned back in his chair and gazed mildly at the butler. "There must be an answer to the problem which I put to you, Hubbard." Hubbard wrinkled his brows in thought, and succeeded only in looking 110 years old. He had the melancholy look of a molting bird. He shook his head and drooped. "No doubt, sir," he said. "But as far as you are concerned," Mr. Hazlewood continued briskly, "you can throw no light upon it?" "Not a glimmer, sir." Mr. Hazlewood was disappointed, and with him disappointment was petulance. "That is unlike you, Hubbard," he said, "for sometimes after I have been deliberating for days over some curious and perplexing conundrum, you have solved it the moment it has been put to you." Hubbard drooped still lower. He began the droop as a bow of acknowledgment, but forgot to raise his head again. "It is very good of you, sir," he said. He seemed oppressed by the goodness of Mr. Hazlewood. "Yet you are not clever, Hubbard, not at all clever." "No, sir, I know my place," returned the butler, and Mr. Hazlewood continued with a little envy. "You must have some wonderful gift of insight which guides you straight to the inner meaning of things." "It's just common sense, sir," said Hubbard. "But I haven't got it!" cried Mr. Hazlewood. "How's that?" "You don't need it, sir. You are a gentleman," Hubbard replied, and carried the letters to the door. There, however, he stopped. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, "but a new parcel of The Prison Walls has arrived this morning. Shall I unpack it?" Mr. Hazlewood frowned and scratched his ear. "Well, no, Hubbard, no," he said, with a trifle of discomfort. "I am not sure, indeed, that The Prison Walls is not almost one of my mistakes. We all make mistakes, Hubbard. I think you shall burn that parcel, Hubbard, somewhere where it won't be noticed." "Certainly, sir," said Hubbard. "I'll burn it under the shadow of the south wall." Mr. Hazlewood looked up with a start. Was it possible that Hubbard was poking fun at him? The mere notion was incredible, and indeed Hubbard shuffled with so much meekness from the room that Mr. Hazlewood dismissed it. He went across the hall to the dining-room, where he found Henry Thresk trifling with his breakfast. No embarrassment weighed upon Mr. Hazlewood this morning. He effervesced with good humour. "I do not blame you, Mr. Thresk," he said, "for the side you took yesterday afternoon. You were a stranger to us in this house. I understand your position." "I am not quite so sure, Mr. Hazlewood," said Thresk dryly, "that I understand yours. For my part, I have not closed my eyes all night. You, on the other hand, seem to have slept well." "I did indeed," said Hazlewood. "I was relieved from a strain of suspense under which I have been labouring for a month past. To have refused my consent to Richard's marriage with Stella Ballantyne on no other grounds than that social prejudice forbade it would have seemed a complete, a stupendous reversal of my whole theory and conduct of life. I should have become an object of ridicule. People would have laughed at the philosopher of Little Beeding. I have heard their laughter all this month. Now, however, once the truth is known, no one will be able to say—" Henry Thresk looked up from his plate aghast. "Do you mean to say, Mr. Hazlewood, that after Mrs. Ballantyne has told her story, you mean to make that story public?" Mr. Hazlewood stared in amazement at Henry Thresk. "But of course," he said. "Oh, you can't be thinking of it." "But I am. I must do it. There is so much at stake," replied Hazlewood. "What?" "The whole consistency of my life. I must make it clear that I am not acting upon prejudice or suspicion or fear of what the world will say, or for any of the conventional reasons which might guide other men." To Thresk this point of view was horrible, and there was no arguing against it. It was inspired by the dreadful vanity of a narrow, shallow nature, and Thresk's experience had never shown him anything more difficult to combat and overcome. "So, for the sake of your reputation for consistency, you will make a very unhappy woman bear shame and obloquy which she might easily be spared? You could find 1,000 excuses for breaking off the marriage." "You put the case very harshly, Mr. Thresk," said Hazlewood, "but you have not considered my position." And he went indignantly back to the library. Thresk shrugged his shoulders. After all, if Dick Hazlewood turned his back upon Stella, she would not hear the abuse or suffer the shame. That she would take the dark journey as he declared he could not doubt. And no one could prevent her, not even he himself, though his heart might break at her taking it. All depended upon Dick. He appeared a few minutes afterwards, fresh from his ride, glowing with good humour and contentment. But the sight of Thresk surprised him. "Hullo!" he cried. "Good morning. I thought you were going to catch the 8:45." "I felt lazy," answered Thresk. "I sent off some telegrams to put off my engagements." "Good," said Dick, and he sat down at the breakfast table. As he poured out a cup of tea, Thresk said, "I think I heard you were over 30. "Yes?" "30's a good age," said Thresk. "It looks back on youth," answered Dick. "That's just what I mean," remarked Thresk. "Do you mind a cigarette?" "Not at all." Thresk smoked, and while he smoked he talked, not carelessly, yet careful not to emphasize his case. Youth is a graceful thing of high-sounding words and impetuous thoughts, but like many other graceful things, it can be very hard and very cruel. Dick Hazlewood looked closely and quickly at his companion, but he answered casually, "It is supposed to be generous." "And it is, to itself," replied Thresk. "Generous when its sympathies are enlisted, generous so long as all goes well with it, generous because it is confident of triumph. But its generosity is not a matter of judgment. It does not come from any wide outlook upon a world where there is a good deal to be said for everything. It is a matter of physical health." "Yes?" said Dick. "And once affronted, once hurt, youth finds it difficult to forgive." So far both men had been debating on an abstract topic without any immediate application to themselves. But now Dick leaned across the table with a smile upon his face, which Thresk did not understand. "And why do you say this to me this morning, Mr. Thresk?" he asked pointedly. "Yes, it's rather an impertinence, isn't it?" Thresk agreed. "But I was looking into a case late last night in which irrevocable and terrible things are going to happen if there is not forgiveness." Dick took his cigarette case from his pocket. "I see," he remarked, and struck a match. Both men rose from the table, and at the door Dick turned. "Your case, of course, has not yet come on," he said. "No," answered Thresk, "but it will very soon." They went into the library, and Mr. Hazlewood greeted his son with a vivacity which for weeks had been absent from his demeanour. "Did you ride this morning?" he asked. "Yes, but Stella didn't. She sent word over that she was tired. I must go across and see how she is." Mr. Hazlewood interposed quickly. "There is no need of that, my boy. She is coming here this morning." "Oh?" Dick looked at his father in astonishment. "She said no word of it to me last night, and I saw her home. I suppose she sent word over about that too?" He looked from one to the other of his companions, but neither answered him. Some uneasiness, indeed, was apparent in them both. "Oh, ho!" he said with a smile. "Stella's coming over, and I know nothing of it. Mr. Thresk's lazy, so remains at Little Beeding, and delivers a lecture to me over breakfast. And you, father, seem in remarkable spirits." Mr. Hazlewood seized upon the opportunity to interrupt his son's reflections. "I am, my boy," he cried. "I walked in the fields this morning and—" But he got no further with his explanations, for the sound of Mrs. Pettifer's voice rang high in the hall, and she burst into the room. "Harold, I have only a moment. Good morning, Mr. Thresk," she cried in a breath. "I have something to say to you." Thresk was disturbed. Suppose that Stella came while Mrs. Pettifer was here? She must not speak in Mrs. Pettifer's presence. Somehow Mrs. Pettifer must be dismissed. No such anxiety, however, harassed Mr. Hazlewood. "Say it, Margaret," he said, smiling benignantly upon her. "You cannot annoy me this morning. I am myself again." And Dick's eyes turned sharply upon him. "All my old powers of observation have returned, my old interest in the great dark riddle of human life has reawakened. The brain, the sedulous, active brain, resumes its work to-day, asking questions, probing problems. I rose early, Margaret," he flourished his hands like one making a speech, "and walking in the fields amongst the cows, a most curious speculation forced itself upon my mind. How is it, I asked myself—" It seemed that Mr. Hazlewood was destined never to complete a sentence that morning, for Margaret Pettifer at this point banged her umbrella upon the floor. "Stop talking, Harold, and listen to me. I have been speaking with Robert, and we withdraw all opposition to Dick's marriage." Mr. Hazlewood was dumbfounded. "You, Margaret? You, of all people?" he stammered. "Yes," she replied decisively. "Robert likes her, and Robert is a good judge of a woman. That's one thing. Then, I believe, Dick is going to take St. Quentin's. Isn't that so, Dick?" "Yes," answered Dick. "That's the house we looked over yesterday." "Well, it's not a couple of 100 yards from us, and it would not be comfortable for any of us if Dick and Dick's wife were strangers. So I give in. There, Dick." She went across the room and held out her hand to him. "I am going to call on Stella this afternoon." Dick flushed with pleasure. "That's splendid, Aunt Margaret. I knew you were all right, you know. You put on a few frills at first, of course, but you were forgiven." Mr. Hazlewood made so complete a picture of dismay that Dick could not but pity him. He went across to his father. "Now, sir," he said, "let us hear this problem." The old man was not proof against the invitation. "You shall, Richard," he exclaimed. "You are the very man to hear it. Your aunt, Richard, is of too practical a mind for such speculations. It's a most curious problem. Hubbard quite failed to throw any light upon it. I myself am, I confess, bewildered. And I wonder if a fresh young mind can help us to a solution." He patted his son on the shoulder, and then took him away by the arm. "The fresh young mind will have a go, father," said Dick. "Fire away." "I was walking in the fields, my boy." "Yes, sir, among the cows." "Exactly. You put your finger on the very point. How is it, I ask myself—" "That's quite your old style, father." "Now, isn't it, Richard, isn't it?" Mr. Hazlewood dropped Dick's arm. He warmed to his theme. He caught fire. He assumed the attitude of the orator. "How is it that with the advancement of science and the progress of civilization a cow gives no more milk to-day than she did at the beginning of the Christian era?" With outspread arms he asked for an answer, and the answer came. "A fresh young mind can solve that problem in 2 shakes. It is because the laws of nature forbid. That's your trouble, father. That's the great drawback to sentimental enthusiasm. It's always up against the laws of nature." "Dick," said Mrs. Pettifer, "by some extraordinary miracle you are gifted with common sense. I am off." She went away in a hurricane as she had come, and it was time that she did go, for even while she was closing the door Stella Ballantyne came out from her cottage to cross the meadow. Dick was the first to hear the gate click as she unlatched it and passed into the garden. He took a step towards the window, but his father interposed, and for once with a real authority. "No, Richard," he said. "Wait with us here. Mrs. Ballantyne has something to tell us." "I thought so," said Dick quietly, and he came back to the other two men. "Let me understand." His face was grave, but without anger or any confusion. "Stella returned here last night after I had taken her home?" "Yes," said Thresk. "To see you?" "Yes." "And my father came down and found you together?" "Yes." "I heard voices," Mr. Hazlewood hurriedly interposed, "and so naturally I came down." Dick turned to his father. "That's all right, father. I didn't think you were listening at the keyhole. I am not blaming anybody. I want to know exactly where we are. That's all." Stella found the little group awaiting her, and standing up before them she told her story as she had told it last night to Thresk. She omitted nothing, nor did she falter. She had trembled and cried for a great part of the night over the ordeal which lay before her, but now that she had come to it she was brave. Her composure indeed astonished Thresk and filled him with compassion. He knew that the very roots of her heart were bleeding. Only once or twice did she give any sign of what these few minutes were costing her. Her eyes strayed towards Dick Hazlewood's face in spite of herself, but she turned them away again with a wrench of her head and closed her eyelids lest she should hesitate and fail. All listened to her in silence, and it was strange to Thresk that the one man who seemed least concerned of the three was Dick Hazlewood himself. He watched Stella all the while she was speaking, but his face was a mask. Not a gesture or movement gave a clue to his thoughts. When Stella had finished he asked composedly, "Why didn't you tell me all this at the beginning, Stella?" And now she turned to him in a burst of passion and remorse. "Oh, Dick, I tried to tell you. I made up my mind so often that I would, but I never had the courage. I am terribly to blame. I hid it all from you. Yes. But oh, you meant so much to me. You yourself, Dick. It wasn't your position. It wasn't what you brought with you, other people's friendship, other people's esteem. It was just you. I longed for you to want me as I wanted you." Then she recovered herself and stopped. She was doing the very thing she had resolved not to do. She was pleading, she was making excuses. She drew herself up and with a dignity which was quite pitiful she now pleaded against herself. "But I don't ask for your pity. You mustn't be merciful. I don't want mercy, Dick. That's of no use to me. I want to know what you think, just what you really and truthfully think. That's all. I can stand alone if I must. Oh, yes, I can stand alone." And as Thresk stirred and moved, knowing well in what way she meant to stand alone, Stella turned her eyes full upon him in warning, nay, in menace. "I can stand alone quite easily, Dick. You mustn't think that I should suffer so very much. I shouldn't. In spite of her control a sob broke from her throat and her bosom heaved, and then Dick Hazlewood went quietly to her side and took her hand. "I didn't interrupt you, Stella. I wanted you to tell everything now once for all, so that no one of us three need ever mention a word of it again." Stella looked at Dick Hazlewood in wonder, and then a light broke over her face like the morning. His arm slipped around her waist, and she leaned against him, suddenly weak, almost to swooning. Mr. Hazlewood started up from his chair in consternation. "But you heard her, Richard?" "Yes, father, I heard her," he answered. "But you see, Stella is my wife." "Your—" Mr. Hazlewood's lips refused to speak the word. He fell back again in his chair and dropped his face in his hands. "Oh, no!" "It's true," said Dick. "I have rooms in London, you know. I went to London last week. Stella came up on Monday. It was my doing, my wish. Stella is my wife." Mr. Hazlewood groaned aloud. "But she has tricked you, Richard." And Stella agreed. "Yes, I tricked you, Dick. I did," she said miserably, and she drew herself from his arm. But he caught her hand. "No, you didn't." He led her over to his father. "That's where you both make your mistake. Stella tried to tell me something on the very night when we walked back from this house to her cottage and I asked her to marry me. She has tried again often during the last weeks. I knew very well what it was. Before you turned against her, before I married her. She didn't trick me." Mr. Hazlewood turned in despair to Henry Thresk. "What do you say?" he asked. "That I am very glad you asked me here to give my advice on your collection," Thresk answered. "I was inclined yesterday to take a different view of your invitation, but I did what perhaps I may suggest you should do. I accepted the situation." He went across to Stella and took her hands. "Oh, thank you," she cried. "Thank you." "And now," Thresk turned to Dick, "if I might look at a Bradshaw? I could find out the next train to London." "Certainly," said Dick, and he went over to the writing table. Stella and Henry Thresk were left alone for a moment. "We shall see you again," she said. "Please." Thresk laughed. "No doubt. I am not going out into the night. You know my address. If you don't, ask Mr. Hazlewood. It's in King's Bench Walk, isn't it?" And he took the timetable from Dick Hazlewood's hand. End of Chapter 27. Recording by Nicholas Clifford, Middlebury, Vermont, USA. End of The Witness for the Defence by A.E.W. Mason.